Special pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Stanislav Grof. Dr. Grof will probably be known to most of you as one of the most distinguished researchers and psychiatrists, especially concerned with the area of non-ordinary states. He is one of the originators and chief researchers in the area of psychedelics and their effect on human consciousness, as well as conscious states which are induced by other methods and means. In addition, he was the founder and chief theoretician of a very important movement in the United States, and I think also throughout the world now, in transpersonal psychology, and was the founding president of the International Transpersonal Association. It holds conferences, international conferences of extraordinary interest, the next one of which will be taking place next May in Brazil, for those of you who'd like to travel to an exotic place, entitled Technologies of the Sacred. He's the author of several books, including The Holotropic Mind, The Adventure of Self-Discovery, Beyond the Brain, The Stormy Search of the Self, and is now busy lecturing and conducting trainings all over the world, especially with regards to his holotropic breathwork. So without further ado, let me turn over the occasion to Stanislav Grof.
Good morning. Before I start my talk this morning, I would like to express my thanks to the organizers and the sponsors who made it possible for me to be here and given this opportunity to share with you material that certainly is challenging and controversial. I would like to also apologize. I will have to leave early this conference, which I regret very much, but when I heard about the conference, I already had some other plans, so I managed just to sandwich a couple of days. And we spent yesterday a brainstorming session with the presenters, and it's going to be a very, very interesting time, and I'm really sorry that I will not be able to be here with you. It's going to be recorded, so I can catch up with what happened here. When I give lectures to audiences, particularly when there are people from the academic circles, I usually start with a few biographical anecdotes, because my colleagues from the academia have great problems understanding how it is possible that somebody with the right education and the right credentials can take spirituality seriously and be interested in mysticism, be involved in something like transpersonal psychology, talk about spiritual emergencies that are psychotic breaks, and also write books with strange titles like Beyond the Brain or The Adventure of Self-Discovery. So I'd like to just tell you something about my early history. I was not brought up in a setting that was in any way religious. It was a very atheistic context, and it goes back to a drama or scandal in our family. My parents met in a small Czech town, and when they fell in love, wanted to get married, there was a problem because my mother was from a strict Catholic family. My father didn't have any church affiliation, and my grandparents thought that the only decent joining is one that happens in church. And the local church in this small Czech town refused to marry them. So there was a lot of turmoil, and the whole thing was solved by a major financial donation that my grandparents made to the church. So the dream of my grandparents came true. They lived on Main Street, and so they could roll out the carpets. They stopped the traffic, and the guests could go from the altar right to the banquet. And my parents got so disillusioned by the situation that they decided they wouldn't commit me or my brother to any religion, and that we should make our own mind when we come of age. So I had this basically atheistic background, and from this I went to medical school. It certainly doesn't particularly cultivate mystical awareness. And in addition, this was at a time when Czechoslovakia was controlled by Marxist regime, so we really got a pure materialistic doctrine. So what happened to me is something that doesn't happen very frequently. That I was brought from atheism to spirituality through laboratory and clinical work. Usually it's the other way around. People are brought up in a religious setting, and when they get exposure to Western science, they tend to somehow reject, whatever they were taught in their childhood. I also didn't think that I would become a psychiatrist. I was very interested in drawing and painting, and especially Walt Disney was my hero. And after finishing what would be called high school, it's called gymnasium in Czechoslovakia, I already was accepted. I was supposed to start working in animated movies, and just at that time, a friend of mine gave me introductory lectures to psychoanalysis by Freud. I read it in one night, and I got so excited that I gave up the cartoons and decided to study medicine with specific goal to become a psychoanalyst. I got involved in a small group of psychoanalysts who were functioning in Prague after the war, and I got a psychoanalytic training. And as I was getting deeper into psychoanalysis, I developed a very deep conflict. There was this ever-increasing intellectual excitement about psychoanalysis as I was reading more and more books to how many obscure areas psychoanalysis has penetrated and given sort of seemingly brilliant explanations. And the other side of it was when I became aware of the limitations of psychoanalysis as a practical, clinical tool, that you have very narrow indication range, and there's a very strict selection of candidates, and even those who are considered good candidates have to commit themselves not for months but for years. And this was difficult for me to understand. Because I was trained as a physician. The idea in medicine was that if you understand the problem really well, you should be able to do something fairly dramatic about it, or at least you should understand why you can't. If you have incurable diseases, you have a sense where the problem is, what would have to change. Whereas here, I was asked to believe that we have total understanding of the problems and that we can do so little about them over such a long period of time. So I started kind of nostalgically thinking back about the cartoons, and I thought this was a major mistake to choose that profession. And at that time, something very powerful happened in my life. We were involved in a study of malaria, which was one of the early tranquilizers that came from Sandoz, a pharmaceutical company. We had a good relationship with Sandoz, and in this context, we got a large box of ampules full of LSD with recommendations how they could be used, and they wanted some feedback from us. They were suggesting that this could be used as an experimental model of psychosis, and that also the early observations have shown that this could be used as a very interesting, unconventional method of training psychiatrists and psychologists. That people in the profession would have this opportunity to spend 6 to 8 hours in the world that many of our patients inhabit and come back with a sort of deeper understanding, be able to understand them better, to relate to them better, and hopefully treat them more effectively. So I became one of the early candidates, and I had such powerful confrontation with my unconscious that it instantly overshadowed everything that I have read in psychoanalysis or that I experienced in psychoanalysis. And I decided that this could be somehow the tool that might make psychoanalysis as powerful as a clinical method as it seemed to be powerful as an explanatory system, conceptual framework. So I started a study in which we were using repeated sessions aided with LSD, and I kept very, very detailed records about all these sessions. And this was the beginning of a very, very powerful adventure, both professional and personal, because I had quite a few of those experiences myself. I was comparing what was happening to other people, what was happening to me. And one of the early things that happened was that people did not stay in the conceptual framework that I was trained in, which was the postnatal biography and the individual unconscious. That as we continued, sooner or later, every person would transcend this framework, which I considered at that time to be the cartography of the psyche. And people started moving into experiences for which I didn't have any conceptual framework, until I realized that we were moving into the realm of the ancient spiritual traditions, or of the spiritual systems of the East. The kind of experiences that were described in different systems of yoga, in Taoism, in Tibetan Buddhism, in Sufism, in Christian mysticism, and also in some of the aboriginal cultures, in the shamanic tradition, in rites of passage, and the mysteries of death rebirth in the Middle East, and so on. So this created a kind of a lifetime interest in non-ordinary states of consciousness. And during this work I became aware that somehow if we would really systematically study the experiences and the observations that occur in non-ordinary states, that we would have to revise in a very profound way not only our ideas about the human psyche and consciousness, but very likely the entire philosophy of Western science, that we would be facing a revolution that would be at least as powerful as what happened to the physicists in the first decades of the century, when they had to move from the Newtonian thinking to theories of relativity and then further to quantum physics. So I'd like to share with you today some of the lessons that I feel we have learned. Primarily in two areas, the heuristic aspect of non-ordinary states, that means what we can learn about the nature of consciousness, the nature of the psyche, and then also the therapeutic potential that I believe is somehow associated with these states. So I'll first give a very brief definition. When I would talk about non-ordinary states, in the broadest sense, we would be talking about episodes of very powerful experiences that would be characterized by changes of perception in the different sensory areas. They would be characterized by powerful emotions covering an extremely wide range, from ecstatic rapture, celestial type of experiences, to abysmal despair and infernal experiences. Very powerful changes in ideation, thought processes, where very unusual insights can come, anything from insights into individual history to powerful philosophical and spiritual insights, and also a variety of psychosomatic manifestations that can be associated with these states. Now, when we say non-ordinary states, is still too broad. We can have non-ordinary states when we have uremia and hallucinate, or have a typhoid fever and hallucinate, or we just had a car accident and brain contusion. So I would like to narrow it to a group for which I haven't found any name. So I coined a name myself. I call them holotropic. It's a subgroup of non-ordinary states of consciousness, where consciousness is changed very profoundly, qualitatively, but it's not impaired in any way. And this differentiates the holotropic states from, let's say, trivial deliria, where there is disorientation. The person doesn't know who they are, where they are, what time it is. Their intellect doesn't function, and they have amnesia for those states. Now, just to give you a sense of the range of experiences that we are talking about, the holotropic experiences would be experiences that you find in shamanic procedures, that you find in the aboriginal rites of passage. Just about every major pre-industrial culture had powerful rituals, rites of passage at the time of important social or biological transitions. We find them in healing rituals of aboriginal cultures, or any kind of other ceremony, initiation, and so on. We find them in the mysteries of death and rebirth. For example, the Isis and Osiris mysteries, the Bacchanalia, the Dionysian rites, the mysteries of Attis, Adonis, the Eleusinian mysteries. There's a book by Dr. Hoffman, Gordon Wasson, and Weyer, and all the major figures in ancient history were initiates of one or another kind of mystery religion. Plato, Aristotle, Pindarus, Alcibiades, even Cicero came to participate. And in this book they came to the conclusion that the potion which was being offered there, Kikeon, that this was an ergot preparation very similar to LSD, so that was a psychedelic religion that lasted for almost 2,000 years and had very, very likely an impact on the entire European history that still is not appreciated. Another area where we find holotropic states is the area of the spiritual practices, the mystical traditions. I already mentioned the different systems of yoga, Taoism, Tibetan Buddhism, and so on. And another area would be modern clinical and laboratory research. We have been able to research some of those states using modern methods. Now, in terms of the techniques of inducing holotropic states, there's a wide range of different combinations of drumming, rattling, or other percussion instruments, dancing, fasting, sleep deprivation, social isolation, like staying in a cave or in the desert or on a mountaintop, extreme physical pain, for example, the sun dance of the Lakota Sioux Indians, bloodletting as it is in the Maya culture, and then, of course, psychedelic plants, peyote, ayahuasca, psychedelic mushrooms, hashish, and so on, snuffs, the Caribbean snuffs, and so on. And then we have the modern means of inducing these holotropic states. The most important, of course, being psychedelic substances. We now have pure alkaloids from most of the known psychedelic plants, psilocybin, mescaline, tryptamine derivatives, MMDA, and so on, MDA, and also LSD, which is a semi-synthetic psychedelic substance. Then some of the other modern means are, for example, sensory deprivation, experiments with sensory overload, sleep and dream deprivation. Dream deprivation when you prevent REM sleep, but you let people sleep. Otherwise, the experiments of lucid dreaming, biofeedback, the alpha theta feedback, use of various kinesthetic devices, the rotating couch or the water bed that you feed frequencies, or the witch's cradle, which is a medieval instrument that was reconstructed by Gene Houston and Bob Masters. And then a very important area where holotropic states occur, which are various forms of powerful experiential psychotherapy. So you can see those states when people go through some neo-Reichian sessions, certainly in primal therapy sessions, the different techniques using breathing, like the holotropic breathwork or reversing. These states were also seen in marathon sessions where people were sleep deprived and fasting and being involved in extreme emotional interaction. Nude marathon sessions, aqua energetic, that Paul Windring was doing. Those are all situations where we these days see holotropic states. And what is also very important is that we see holotropic states in people occurring in everyday life. They don't have to do anything for it. They don't even want those states. They fight them, and yet these states would emerge spontaneously. Now, if we look now at holotropic states and we compare the attitude of all ancient and pre-industrial cultures and the attitude of the industrial civilization, we see a fundamental difference in all ancient and pre-industrial cultures that I have studied. The non-ordinary states of consciousness, particularly the holotropic variety, were held in very high esteem. And people spend a lot of time and energy trying to develop some safe means of inducing these states and support systems. They knew how to support people when they were having these experiences. They were using these as main vehicle of their ritual and spiritual life in the context of various ceremonies, healing rituals, and so on. So these were states in which they connected to some other dimensions of reality, to, we would say, the archetypal realm. They were experiencing deities. They were tuning into nature in a very different way, the forces of nature, identification with animals, and so on. They were also connecting with each other in a different way. Victor Turner, an American anthropologist, wrote that cultures that were sharing these non-ordinary states of consciousness developed deep bondings, what he calls a sense of community, communitas. These states also were used for diagnosing various disorders and healing various disorders. I don't know any culture where if you have a problem you would go to a shaman and shaman would say, tell me about your problems, and then gives you interpretations. The healing in pre-industrial cultures always was synonymous with a holotropic state. Either the client is in a holotropic state, or the healer, or both of them, or there is an entire group like the Kalahari Bushmen who enters a non-ordinary state, and then healing happens in that context. So the main vehicle of ritual spiritual life, something used for diagnosing and healing of various disorders. Another use would be cultivation of intuition and extrasensory perception. It's known that non-ordinary states, the holotropic states, are conducive to extrasensory perception. They were also using them for practical purposes in connection with ESP, like finding lost persons, lost objects, or the shamans following the movement of game and so on. And also as artistic inspiration, the shamans would get ideas for rituals, they would get their songs and so on from these non-ordinary states. So this was an extremely important part of life in all ancient and pre-industrial cultures. Now this has an extremely long tradition because these techniques are very, very significant for shamanism. We have in the caves of the Franco-Cantabrian province in southern France and northern Spain, Altamira, Les Trois Frères, Font de Gomme, Nyon, and so on. We have these beautiful images of animals, but among those animals are also figures that are not animals, that have been identified as figures of the first shamans. In one of the caves they actually found, when the discoverer came there, they found footprints arranged in a circle indicating that they were doing a circular trance dance of the kind that still today you can see in certain pre-industrial cultures. So this is a very, very old enterprise, the use of non-ordinary states. Now this is not only ancient, it goes back to the Paleolithic, but it's also universal. You find shamanism in North America and South America, in Polynesia, in Micronesia, throughout Asia, Indonesia, Australia, Europe, Africa. So it's something that relates to what the anthropologists call the primal mind. It's when we respond to it no matter what our sex is, no matter what our race is, no matter what the historical period is. This is something that somehow influences everybody who's human on a very, very profound level. Now, Michael Harner, who's a good friend and combines good academic training in anthropology with personal initiation that he got when he was working in the Amazon. So he's a kind of he practices shamanism, and he also is an academician of good standing. He says about this, when something is around for 40,000 years and keeps making sense to people, we better pay attention to it. There's probably something to it, because therapeutic fads kind of come and go, but this is something that survived a very, very long time all over the world. Now, if we compare this attitude to holotropic states that we find in ancient and pre-industrial cultures, with the attitude of, in the Western civilization, in the technologized societies, we see a tremendous difference. We have pathologized all non-ordinary states, with the exception of dreams. When they are not repetitive and not associated with anxiety, you are allowed to dream and be considered normal. But otherwise, every non-ordinary state, every holotropic state would be considered pathological. We don't have any distinction between mysticism and psychosis. In other words, every non-ordinary state of consciousness, no matter what kind, would be seen as something that's pathological, and there's a tendency to suppress these states routinely. I've seen a lot of people who had what in the mystical tradition would be a pure spiritual experience, and they were given tranquilizers or electroshocks, lifetime labels, and so on. Now, until we didn't have any possibility of a different kind of description than a pathological diagnosis until very recently. There are three professionals in the United States who, after long effort, got a new category into the DSM-4, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. We now have a category of psychospiritual and psychoreligious problems, so that you don't have to give that diagnosis. But the question is how psychiatrists are going to use it, and then particularly what the insurance companies are going to do. Willing to pay if somebody needs support for psychospiritual or psychoreligious problems. Now, basically, the Western science has been dominated by what has been called the Newtonian Cartesian paradigm. I think it's a misnomer. Doesn't certainly do justice to Newton or Descartes. But basically, we see the universe as a material system. The only thing that really exists is matter. The history of the universe is the history of developing matter. And in this context, life, consciousness, intelligence, those are insignificant epiphenomena that happened after billions of years of this mechanical development in a very insignificant part of the universe. In a universe that's described in this way, there's absolutely no place for spirituality. So strictly speaking, if somebody is spiritual, has spiritual inclination in our culture, this itself would be considered pathological, or at least signifying lack of education. That person doesn't know enough about what science has discovered about the universe. It has something to do with superstition. It's primitive, magical thinking. If it happens to somebody who cannot be accused of lack of education, we have then psychoanalysis that shows that this is really emotional immaturity. This is regression to infantile omnipotence. These are infantile images of parents that are being projected, the heavens and so on. And when somebody has then direct experiences that we call now transpersonal spiritual experiences, that would be seen as gross pathology. So with this kind of attitude, we have really, if you think about it, pathologized the entire spiritual history of humanity. Because all great religions started from visionary experiences. If you read the Pali Canon, you have the experience of the Buddha sitting under the bo tree, the visitation of Kamamara and his daughters, and the attack of Kamamara's army, then at a later date, a sequence of past life experiences with the experience of tearing of karmic bonds and freeing himself from the karmic connections. If we read the story of Jesus, we have the temptation in the desert, the visitation of the devil, the same in the life of the saints, Saint Anthony, the temptation. Those are all powerful visionary experiences. The miraculous journey of Muhammad, which was the origin of Islam, was a visionary experience of Archangel Gabriel, who took him through a trip through the heavens and paradise and Gehenna, hell, and he had a direct experience of Allah when he received the articles of Quran and so on. So those are the beginning of all religions, are what we call now transpersonal experiences, visionary experiences. And in traditional psychiatry, this is all psychotic stuff. This is all right from the handbooks of psychiatry. Mohammed, for example, was diagnosed as, by Western psychiatrists as an epileptic, and his visions were attributed to that. And the other visionary experiences would be psychotic. St. John was described as hereditary degenerative. St. Teresa of Avila, severe hysterical psychosis, and so on. The anthropologists who got this training have been discussing whether shamans are schizophrenics, maybe ambulant psychotics, or maybe hysterics or epileptics, because they can go through some seizure-like activity. And we have even a paper by Franz Alexander, one of the founders of psychosomatic medicine, that's called Buddhist Training is Artificial Catatonia. So even when you meditate, you get suspect. So this is a very interesting situation. For example, in the United States, we have a Bible in every motel, in your bedside table, and even presidents would pay lip service to God. But when somebody would have a full-blown spiritual experience in church, your average minister would send them to psychiatrists, because this kind of thing is not supposed to happen in church. It belongs to psychiatrists. So we go, we listen about people who had experiences 2,000 years ago. That's part of our Holy Scripture. But similar experiences today would be seen as pathological. Now, Michael Harner, whom I mentioned already, when he looked at Western psychiatry and psychology from this dual perspective of somebody who is Western trained professional, but at the same time somebody who experienced the initiation, shamanic initiation. He belongs to a group of anthropologists who call themselves visionary anthropologists. In other words, they combine what's called in anthropology etic and emic perspective. Etic is the kind of a distant, objective description, and the emic approach is actually the position of the natives themselves. So when he looks at Western psychiatry and psychology, he says these are biased in two significant, or at least two significant ways. He says they are ethnocentric, which means it's a perspective of one particular culture, that culture itself considered to be superior to any other groups throughout history, and groups, pre-industrial groups existing in today's world. So, this includes the definition of mental health. If, for example, we would go with our Western training to India and see what the yogis and the sadhus are doing, they would be ambulant psychotics, as I mentioned, at least. Or if we go and see what the shamans are doing in Mexico, or Native American shaman. But if you would take, let's say, a Mexican shaman to Los Angeles, and not even at the time when they were burning their own houses, but just an ordinary day in Los Angeles, that person would think that we are a culture that went totally bananas. There's the earth that we come from that nourishes us, that's covered, every square yard is covered with cement, beton. People can't breathe the air anymore. They question the quality of water and the food that they are eating, and they're still into more money, status, gross national product, and so on. This is totally incomprehensible for somebody who comes from a culture that has any kind of really deep connection with nature, is aware of cosmic cycles, of natural cycles, and so on. You had the war in the Middle East. So according to some estimates, over 200,000 people in Iraq killed in a way that resembles a computer game. On the other side was 70 people, some of them friendly fire. 500 oil wells burning as if we didn't have enough pollution. Deliberate oil spills killing the life in the Persian Gulf for the next 20 years. And we sit and watch it on the television. It's just another day in the Western civilization. And when somebody has a past life experience, we log them up, sort of. So this is what Michael means by an ethnocentric concept of mental health. Then he talks about another bias that we have in Western psychiatry, and that's interesting for us this morning. He calls it cognicentric. Probably a better term would be pragmacentric. What he means by that is that we have, in our speculations in psychiatry and psychology, we have really looked selectively at observations and experiences made in the ordinary state of consciousness. We have systematically screened out anything that comes from these other observations, from these other areas. You can think about some of the fantastic observations of thanatologists about disembodied consciousness maintaining the capacity of perception. People in a near-death state experiencing something in another part of the building or 200 miles away. Ken Ring is now doing study of blind people, showing that congenitally blind people can see in a near-death situation. So these are observations that would be enough to really topple the entire concept that we have about the relationship, about the nature of consciousness, the relationship between consciousness and matter, and a variety of other things. So he talks about Western psychology and psychiatry as being ethnocentric and as being cognicentric. Now then the interesting question is, what would then be the new psychology or the new science that would not be ethnocentric and that would not be cognicentric? That means one that would be applicable to all groups, human groups throughout history, without labeling them sort of as psychotic or primitive, kind of across the board. Something that would be applicable to all cultures, that would treat with respect the ritual and spiritual life of other cultures, and that would also be willing to face the observations that are coming from the different areas of the study of non-ordinary states of consciousness, or I would say holotropic states, which means what was discovered in psychedelic research, the information that's coming from thanatology, the information that's coming from parapsychology, the observations that were made with biofeedback, with sensory isolation, and then particularly the repeated observations and experiences that we see in powerful forms of experiential psychotherapy. So I believe that if we would look at the evidence from non-ordinary states, that we would have to make some fundamental revisions, at least in these 6 different categories. The first would be the nature and dimensions of consciousness and the new cartography of the psyche. So it would have something to do with the fact that you could not see consciousness anymore as just an epiphenomenon of neurophysiological processes. If you really look at that material, consciousness would be seen at least as an equal partner, very likely supraordinated, but at least somehow permeating all of existence. And the psyche would, every individual person would appear to be something that has many more levels, many more dimensions than we have accepted in traditional psychiatry. We have in traditional psychiatry, by and large, if you think about it, a conceptual framework that certainly includes the body, in particular the brain, as supposedly the source of consciousness. And then we have, in terms of what we could call postnatal, what we could call software in computer language, this would be limited to postnatal biography. We start describing the human psychological history from the time after the child is born. Freud said that the newborn was tabula rasa, was a clean slate. There was nothing there of interest for psychologists, although at one point he briefly entertained the possibility that maybe anxiety can be traced all the way to the birth canal, but then he sort of abandoned it, and when Otto Rank came with a psychology that was including the birth trauma, he was excommunicated from the psychedelic movement. So I myself tried to create a cartography, first on the basis of observations from psychedelic states, and then from the holotropic breathwork. And this is much more convincing if the same kinds of experiences happen with a little more breathing and with music than if it happens after the administration of some exotic substance. But basically, you will see the same kinds of experiences, whether it's induced by psychedelic substances, by breathing, or whether these experiences happen spontaneously to people. So I had to add two new domains to the cartography of the psyche. The Western traditional map just is limited to postnatal biography. I had to add two dimensions, one that I call perinatal. Peri means around, natalis means pertaining to birth. This includes experiences that people have when they regress to the memory and the record of the birth trauma. Now, these experiences systematically show that there is a powerful record of birth that takes many, many hours really to bring into consciousness and integrate. So this itself was the first major challenge, because most people in the academia hold the position that because the cortex is not mature, the cortex of the newborn, it's not myelinized, that there cannot possibly be any record. So the birth is not seen as being significant unless it's so severe that it damages the brain cells. As an experience, it's not considered to be a psychotrauma, which certainly is not true. The people who do experiential work see daily experiences of reliving birth. I'm sure if you would ask, can I ask you how many of you had the experience of reliving birth? Okay. Now, what is important about the perinatal level, it is not only reliving of the biological imprint of birth, which you can get with details concerning the type of anesthesia that was used, whether there was a breech position, umbilical cord around the neck, the forceps. You can see quadrangular bruises appearing in people who are reliving birth without them being touched. You can see a replay of the birth situation on the cellular level. But that's just one aspect of the perinatal level. The other one, as you will see, is that when people regress to birth, they also connect typically with the archetypal domain of the collective unconscious, or the historical domain of the collective unconscious in the Jungian sense. So, for example, being stuck in the birth canal can be associated with images of hell, or identification with the archetypal image of Sisyphus. It can also be associated with identification with prisoners of different ages, prisoners in dungeons, people in concentration camps, and so on. So suddenly you connect through the extreme experience of your own birth, you connect somehow with people who are in similar predicaments. You connect to the collective unconscious, or in the historical or the archetypal sense. Okay, the struggle through the birth canal when the cervix is open can be associated with images of revolution, enough of oppression. We're going to overthrow the tyrant. We're going to breathe freely. So at the time when people are reliving birth, you can get opening into the collective unconscious, describing revolutions, or into the archetypal unconscious, where you would get identification with images, archetypal images representing death rebirth. For example, identification with Christ on the cross, or identification with Apis, Adonis, with Dionysus, and so on. So the experience of the perinatal level is also a gateway into the collective unconscious, and in that sense it's an important turning point. This is where people experience opening to spirituality, opening to the mystical dimension. And at this point, like in my own case, it has nothing to do with their childhood. It has nothing to do with the programs. This is simply opening of intrinsic spiritual resources in one's own personality. When Jung talked about it, he didn't talk about the perinatal level, but he talked about the fact that psychological processes, experiences that come from the deeper dynamic of the psyche, have a quality that he described as numinosity. He used Rudolf Otto's term. He didn't want to call it religious, mystical, occult, because this is loaded. So this is a nice neutral term. When we reach, in this sense, at least the perinatal level, but then certainly the transpersonal level in the unconscious, we would have experiences that have this primary quality that we can call numinosity. We know that we are now in a realm that's outside of the ordinary, that is sacred, that is holy in a sense, and this is primary attribute of that experience. I have worked with many people who were Marxists, cynics, skeptics, even positivistic scientists, and when they have this experience on this level, they automatically discover that spirituality is a significant dimension of the human psyche and also of the universal scheme of things. So this is the first domain that we have to add, which is the perinatal domain, the experiences that happen in connection with reliving of birth, and actually the opening into the collective unconscious, or into the transpersonal domain. And then we have the transpersonal domain per se, where we can talk about three large categories of experiences. I will just very briefly go through it. The transpersonal means that we somehow transcend our identification with the body ego, or what Alan Watts called the skin-encapsulated ego. And we have experiences where we become somebody, something else, somewhere else, and we would have a full sense of identification with that new person, animal, place, and so on. So there are three large categories of transpersonal experiences. In the first one, it's primarily the spatial separation which is transcended. This is where we can become suddenly other people, or we can experience union with other people. We can experience group consciousness, experience ourselves as being all children of the world, all mothers, or in the extreme, all of humanity, that we experience the intensity of sadness that appears to be the sadness of the human condition rather than our individual sadness, or experience ourselves as a cosmic human being, and so on. We can identify with animals in a very, very convincing way, anything from primates all the way down to bacteria or even viruses. Now, what is fascinating here, and I don't have time to give you examples, there are quite a few of them in the book The Holotropic Mind, or Beyond the Brain, or The Adventure of Self-Discovery. I'm now convinced that when you have these experiences, that you really identify in an authentic way with the animal or with another person, to the point that you can get absolutely new information. It's like an alternative way of getting to know the world, not by observing, by perceptual observation and analysis and synthesis, but by changing your consciousness, and in that context becoming something or somebody else, and you learn kind of at first hand what that experience is like. Now it goes even beyond that. It can go into the botanical realm, or even the inorganic world, inorganic processes, inorganic objects. So these are experiences that suggest that everything in the universe exists either as something that could be perceived as an object or as a subjective state of mind. Everything has been worked out both ways. It's very similar to what you find in the great spiritual philosophies of the East. I mean, all of existence is transformation of Brahma, or of Tao, and so on. Now, the second category of transpersonal experiences primarily involves transcendence of linear time. In the ordinary state of consciousness, we can always experience with all the senses only what's happening right here and right now. Memory is a different kind of experience that lost much of the immediacy and the vividness. And the future, we feel helpless in terms of experiencing the future. It hasn't happened in 3D yet, so how could we experience the future? In non-ordinary states, it is possible to either travel into the past or bring the past into the present. So you might be experiencing yourself as a victim of the Aztecs, or being somewhere in a torture chamber of the Inquisition at another time, in another place, as another person. Sometimes with the feeling of continuity, that you actually feel that you once were that person. You have a sense of remembering that this is not the first time it's happening to you. And then people talk about past life experiences. And we are then in the realm of the great spiritual systems again. All the major religions in India have the concept of incarnation as a really cornerstone. You find it in the North and South America, you find it in Polynesia, you find it in ancient Greece and many other places. So reincarnation, in my understanding now, is not a matter of believing or not believing something. It's an attempt to explain experiences that happen to us and the phenomena around it. It's a pretty good theory. It's not the only possible interpretation of these kinds of observations, but it's certainly, I would consider it superior to the one that we find in mainstream psychiatry that considers the whole area as a nonsense. Christopher Beige, in his wonderful book Life Cycles, which is about reincarnation, said that people who don't think it's interesting to research the area of reincarnation are even uninformed or thick-headed. That they don't know what the phenomena are that underlie the belief in reincarnation, or if they know the facts and they don't consider it interesting, that it's quite strange. Okay, the third category of transpersonal experiences are experiences that are even stranger, if you can believe that. Basically, what we discussed up to this point are experiences where the content is nothing unusual. We know that or believe that there was a French Revolution, only we should not have a direct experience of it. We know that there are pregnant whales in the world, but I should not be able to experience myself as a pregnant whale. Or we know that something's happening now in San Francisco, but if I am here, I should not be able to perceive what's happening in San Francisco. So the problem in these two categories of the experience is not the content, but is the access to the information about that phenomenon. But there is this third category of experiences which would take us into the archetypal world. It would take us into the world of mythology, where we can experience the dancing Shiva, or become the dancing Shiva, or Virgin Mary, or the great Mother Goddess of the Middle East, and so on. And what's fascinating, again, even these experiences can bring absolutely new information. This is very similar to what originally led Jung actually to the assumption that there is not just the individual unconscious, but also collective unconscious. We can, in non-ordinary states, get access to mythological beings and mythological realms as they are described by the different cultures, whether or not we know that particular mythological framework or not. So these are experiences that now show, not only that consciousness is not just, or cannot be an epiphenomenon of neurophysiological processes, that has a totally different status, totally different role in the universe, but it also shows that the psyche of each of us, in principle, is commensurate with all of existence, in the sense that there are no boundaries between our individual psyche and the rest of existence are absolutely, can be transcended to the point that we can experience with any part of the universal network, and when all boundaries melt, we can experience ourselves as the creative principle itself. Here we are to the famous statement of the Upanishads, Tattvam Asi. Each of us is, in a sense, Godhead, because when we transcend all the boundaries that separate us from the source, we become the source. It's something that's experientially available to us. Now, just very briefly, the other points. Now, in terms of emotional and psychosomatic disorders, now we distinguish in psychiatry those that are organic, where we find something specific, and then a lot of them where we don't find any medical basis, that we call psychogenic, related to learning, sort of in the broadest sense. Now, these would be seen again in traditional academic thinking as a being of postnatal origin. Somehow it's depending on when the trauma happens, at what time, and you can develop different forms, obsessive compulsive neurosis, anxiety neurosis, and so on, or anxiety hysteria. So the idea is that the whole history of an emotional and psychosomatic disorder that's psychogenic is a postnatal affair. And then also therapeutically it should be enough just to work with postnatal biographical material, the relationship to the mother, father, the psychosexual traumas, the Oedipal issues and so on. You should be able to resolve any problem that is psychogenic just staying in the biographical realm. As you know, it's easier said than done. Now if we work with non-ordinary states, what we'll find out is that the non-ordinary state has a peculiar quality. It finds in the psyche the areas which have a strong emotional charge, and the process will automatically unfold and find additional areas, additional levels. So just supporting the non-ordinary state, healing happens quite automatically. So the process diagnoses, it finds the areas that need the work to be worked on, and it brings them into consciousness for processing. Now, if you then do it, you'll find out that when a person works on a problem like a phobia or asthma, psychosomatic problems, that you usually get first something that is postnatal, something from childhood, something from infancy, that you would expect from the psychoanalytic framework. But it doesn't stop there, and the process goes deeper. You would find then the same problem being related to one particular aspect of the birth trauma. Let's say claustrophobia, the situation when the womb starts closing in. That would be a deeper perinatal root of claustrophobia. And then, beyond that, the process can find areas in the transpersonal realm that underlie that particular problem. For example, a past life experience of being trapped somewhere. So that the full healing then involves experiences on all the levels, not just that the experience on the postnatal level, the infancy, childhood, that will be there. But in addition, there would be a certain aspect of birth, and there could be an archetypal experience, there could be a past life experience, there could be a phylogenetic experience. So you see that emotional and psychosomatic disorders have anchors on different levels of this cartography. They are not limited to the postnatal dynamics. And then the next category, you have the mechanisms of healing and transformation. They also are powerful mechanisms existing on the perinatal level and the transpersonal level, in addition to whatever happens on the biographical level. So for example, a lot of pathological issues can be resolved by a powerful experience of death reverse. The powerful experience of a past life sequence, a powerful emergence of an archetype if it's well integrated. So there are mechanisms of healing and transformation on these other levels as well. Strategy of therapy and self-exploration. We have many, many different schools. Actually, it's fantastic if you think about it, how many different schools, how many different opinions we have. Each of the schools will tell you something different about how the psyche functions, why the symptoms are there, and then particularly what you do therapeutically. You have to learn a technique, and if you're in a particular school, that particular approach will be seen as the scientific approach to the problem. You can have a problem and go to a behaviorist, you get one kind of story and one kind of therapy, then you go to a Freudian, you get another one, and then you stay within the depth psychology. You might go to a Sullivanian or Adlerian, and each of the stories is different, the emphasis is different. So if we have a problem, we can flip a coin and we can choose a school, and we get a different story with each one. And the strange thing is that it doesn't even bother us. We sort of don't think it's peculiar that we have that kind of situation. We just sort of look at the market and we choose a school that we feel attracted to, and we don't have any objective measures that one is superior to the other. We know that in each school there are good therapists and bad therapists, and it's very likely has very little to do with what they think they are doing in terms of the interpretations and the timing and so on. Some people who have done some studies feel that that there is a dimension in psychotherapy that's not covered in any of the schools, something like the quality of human encounter, or the feeling of being unconditionally accepted by another human being, and whatever we do around it doesn't seem to make much difference, because that's different for different schools. So what kind of insight do we get about this? In a sense, it sort of supports something that Jung came up with. Jung, and I'll paraphrase it, Jung's idea was that it's in principle impossible to use your intellect and understand the psyche. Because the psyche, like in this system that I described, in Jungian psychology, the psyche is cosmic. It's anima mundi. The human psyche is just teased out of this universal matrix, and the intellect is just one function. We don't do very well when we look at the sky and trying to figure out the physical universe. There's a statement in Les Miserables. Victor Hugo says, there's one spectacle which is bigger than the ocean, and that is the sky. And there's one spectacle which is bigger than the sky, and that is the human psyche. So we don't do very well even with the physical universe. But we believe that to understand the psyche, it has to be reduced to something as concrete as circumcision or toilet training. So for Jung, the psyche was cosmic. It was a mystery. And his suggestion was that we can do something else. We cannot fix it. We cannot understand the psyche of another person. We cannot understand what the problem is and try to come up with a technique to fix the person. But we can create a supportive environment that is, in Jungian psychology, is sort of compared to the alchemical retort. We can create the supportive environment, and we can then offer some kind of method through which the conscious ego gets in a dynamic dialogue, symbolic dialogue, with a higher aspect of our own personality, which Jung called self. And the healing comes from within. It comes, the psyche, in a sense, heals itself. We don't fix it from the outside. And this is something very, very similar. In a non-ordinary state, what gets mobilized is the spontaneous healing potential of the psyche. And what the best thing we can do as facilitators, as therapists, is to support trustingly what is already happening, even if we don't intellectually understand it. Like in the holotropic breathwork, we frequently support very strange experiences, and if we can stay with them, people get through, and we'll find out that very powerful healing occurred. But if we try to keep the therapeutic process within the context, what makes sense, what's understandable, we very frequently don't get very, very far. We already talked about spirituality versus religion. First of all, this work shows that spirituality is a legitimate dimension of the human psyche. It is a legitimate dimension of the universal scheme of things. That is, being or not being spiritual has something to do with the depths to which we experience our own psyche. If we go deep enough in our self-exploration, that dimension quite automatically opens up. Now there's a fundamental distinction, in my opinion, between spirituality and religion. Not everything that's religious is necessarily spiritual. Something that could be religious and being actually anti-spiritual. So spirituality is related to a direct experience of either another perspective on this everyday reality or experience of another dimension of reality. So it's the experience of the immanent divine or the transcendental divine. And as I mentioned at the beginning of each great religion, there were direct experiences, visionary, transpersonal experiences. Now when a religion becomes organized, it very frequently loses the connection to this spiritual source, and what we get is kind of a dogmatism, moralism, ritualism, something that has nothing to do with a direct personal experience. So spirituality is something that we find in the mystical branches of religion, and the mystics generally are very universal, whereas religion, organized religion, tends to unite within its own realm, but divides in another sense because it sets that group against another, like there are Christians and pagans, and there are Muslims and Hindus and so on. So in a sense, religion understood in this way is more of a problem in today's world than a solution. But if you go within each religious system all the way to the mystical experience, then we have religion that really is universal and unites. Now, in terms of just the last thing, in terms of the human nature, we have in traditional materialistic science, we have the image of human being as basically Newtonian object, as a highly developed animal, as a biological thinking machine made of cells, tissues, organs, and so on. And it holds pretty well as long as we study human beings in the ordinary state of consciousness. We are in the ordinary state of consciousness, and the person is in the ordinary state of consciousness. It doesn't seem to apply to non-ordinary states. When you study human beings, how they appear and what they can do in a non-ordinary state of consciousness, the holotropic state of consciousness, you get a very different definition of what it is to be a human being, which is a field of infinite field of consciousness that has no boundaries, that transcends space and time. So we get a very interesting kind of a complementary definition, which has some kind of remote similarity to the quantum mechanical definition of subatomic matter or light, the wave-particle paradox. In order to describe what a human being is, we say, well, we are Newtonian objects, we are biological machines, but we are also fields of consciousness that have no limits, that can transcend time and space and linear causality. So in some sense, if we would accept this, we would then do something very similar to what pre-industrial cultures were doing, that we spend a good part of our life in the ordinary reality, but we also will have special context in which we pay homage to this other dimension. These other cultures had ritual events, ceremonies, spending some time in meditation and so on, so that you in a sense honor both of those aspects of your personality. And the way Jung described it, we then, in our everyday life, we use a synthesis from what is coming from the outside through our senses and what is coming from within. I will have to end here. I would like to, can I use 5 minutes to show the sequence of slides? Yeah. Okay. Because this is not an easy thing to talk about in a left brain language, in a non-ordinary state. So I would like to show you a very interesting sequence of what happens to one particular person with a high-dose LSD session. She was a professional painter, Harriet Francis. She participated in the Menlo Park experiment in the 60s, the high dose, and most of the experience was on the perinatal level. In other words, it's the level that involves birth, but also the opening into the collective unconscious. So you get a somewhat a different dimension of the process. Okay, can we turn it off? The light? Okay, if you can just look at this to get a sense for the unfolding of the process, of the sequence, and then I will take one picture after another and say something about it. Oh, sorry.
Can you put the overhead? Paul, can you put it towards the screen?
This one?
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Is it better? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. More? Okay. Okay. So, this is the first picture. Now, what you see here, the upper part of the picture, those are geometrical patterns. This is very typical for a fairly superficial form of a non-ordinary state. A lot of the early LSD sessions with smaller dosages could be experienced almost completely in that realm, the static realm.
People talk about kaleidoscopic displays, about stained glass windows from Gothic cathedrals, the arabesques from muslin masks, and so on. Now, those of us who had these experiences, when we saw the first images of the fractals, the computer-generated images based on nonlinear equations, we say, this is it. You know, what was happening, we saw fractals. It's interesting that those are related to the theory of chaos, and this is certainly a stage when you're introducing a certain disorganization into a usual psychic structure. Now, this is where now the Newtonian reality is integrating. She is pretty frightened at this point, is trying to stop it. And as you can see, she cannot stop it and surrenders to the process. And then the next thing that you see, she's being drawn into this vortex. This is very typical beginning of the death rebirth process. For some other people, it can be like being swallowed. For other people, like going into the underworld, the way the Joseph Campbell's hero would go into the underworld, the way Jonas would be swallowed by the whale, and so on. And we can see this mandala, which is made of skulls and rib cages, indicating that she's now being drawn into the realm that has something to do with death. As you can see, this will be very difficult to interpret in Freudian terms. We get a sense that we are in a totally different dimension now. This is the underworld now, the symbols of death, and a very deep, abysmal sense of loneliness. Other people would identify at this point with Christ on the cross. Father, why hast thou forsaken me? Biologically, the underlying level would be the time when the uterus contracts and cuts off the blood supply, the circulation, so the child is now trapped in the womb without connection with the mother. You can see again the underworld here, and this feels like torture, sort of being on a raft, being penetrated by these sharp spikes. A lot of psychosomatic pain can be traced back to the birth experience. That's another aspect of the birth process, feeling crushed, feeling smothered. When she looks up, she sees a human face. Now, this is a very interesting representation of the birth process, which is something very mechanical, the crushing, but at the same time it's coming from a human being. So a kind of a boulder, crushing boulder with human face. It's a very appropriate representation of that. This shows now the ambiguity of the process. You can see that it's related to death as well as birth, which is what real birth is. Many children can die during delivery, or can be born asphyxic, or can be born dead and have to be resuscitated. So in the process of being born, we always taste death to some extent. And this is reflected on the perinatal level, which revolves around these two experiences, birth and death. And activated gives rise to a death rebirth process. This is now the moment that I was talking about, when this deep confrontation with death and birth now opens up the spiritual dimension. This is now symbols of death. The bones are now turning into an altar, crucifix, and we see also these rune-like spiritual symbols, and she's sitting there meditating. Okay, it's a mixture of the obstetric and the archetypal here. She is reliving manual help during the delivery, but it's represented as a help from a demigod who's saving her from the underworld. A very shamanic sequence. You know that the career of many shamans begins with a spontaneous, non-ordinary state where they have the experience of going into the underworld, going through ordeals, being killed, dismembered, and then reborn. So I talked to her. She's basically a neighbor of ours. She didn't know anything about shamanism at the time when this was happening. She didn't know anything about Jungian psychology. This is something that emerged quite spontaneously from her psyche. So this is the rebirth now. And then a stylized identification with Christ, with crucifixion, and a hit of the fractals again. And then a symbolic experience of when the operation, quote unquote, is coming to an end. And then the emergence in connection with the peacock. The peacock, cross-culturally, is a symbol of the paradisian, of the celestial, of rebirth, immortality. In alchemy, we have the Cauda Pavonis, a powerful symbol of transfiguration. Great mothers have peacocks as their symbol, and so on. Very interesting now, after being born, the way is now open into the prenatal state, and from the prenatal state into the transpersonal state, the archetypal. This experience is oceanic. For some other people, it could be experienced as cosmic, this state. Unobstructed universe, no boundary, all is one. And here she's coming down with the feet firmly on the ground, but the head is in clouds, and their birth as symbols of spiritual liberation. I'm sorry I took a little more time than I intended. Thank you very much for your patience.
A little time for questions, yeah? Okay, please.
Yes.
You want to lead?
We have about 10 minutes for questions. We have several. Why don't I just let you pick the ones that you like?
That's not a good way to put it.
Is this working? Hello, my name is Henry Kosh. I'd like to...
Where are you?
Where are you?
Okay.
You do not separate out the non-ordinary state of the awakened mind or enlightened mind, but you do mention that the Buddha entered a visionary state or a holotropic state. Does this imply that you see the enlightened man or mind as one who can enter from the ordinary state of consciousness to a holotropic state, or do you see the enlightened mind as something quite different?
Well, I wouldn't like to put it in such a definite way, enlightened mind, but I can say that many of the experiences that we see are very similar to what you read about in the spiritual literature, described as a process toward spiritual opening, spiritual transformation, and so on. I don't know exactly how to define somebody who's really enlightened and so on. It's much easier to talk about people who have had some powerful mystical spiritual experiences, and whether they integrated them well into their life or not. What would be the state of final enlightenment? I don't think there is any unanimity about it. I certainly would like to make the judgment. Are you doing it?
Well, where's the microphone? Seems to be actively. Why don't you take the one that's closest to you right here?
I'd just like to ask you, Donald Holmes, as you went through the dimensions of the psyche, you seemed to conclude with reference to Jung, something to the equivalent of Jung's collective unconscious. But Jung late in life went beyond that with his references to the psychoid level, where it would seem that somehow or other there was something beyond both psyche and matter which could begin to affect us in ordinary states of consciousness, insofar as there could be these rather strange synchronistic events,
yes,
and possibly other phenomena. Could you comment?
Yes, you see, I just had an hour, so I couldn't complicate it. But if you look in the book, I think it's either Beyond the Brain or The Adventure of Self-Discovery, I have a fourth category of transpersonal experience, specifically borrowing the term psychoid, which are experiences where you have an inner psychological experience, and synchronistically things would happen in the physical world that seems to form a meaningful gestalt. And this was the phenomenon primarily of synchronicity that led Jung to the idea that specifically the archetypes are psychoid. In other words, they are not quite just psychic, nor do they have all the characteristics of physical phenomena, so they are in a kind of twilight zone. So I have a whole category of phenomena that I believe have this quality. I believe that the UFO phenomenon is in that category, that you can't really define it just as hallucination, nor does it have all the characteristics that you could say this is hardware landing, from another galaxy. They're kind of in the twilight zone in between, where sometimes there are peculiar synchronicities, like the 747 flying over Alaska was a Japanese one, and the crew and the passengers saw a spaceship sort of following them, and at the same time the radar, ground-based radar in Alaska, recorded two objects. And then when it made the headlines, the radar operator looked at it and said, on second thought, this was really just an artifact. There was there was not another object there. But there was a correlation between a kind of consensus of a number of people on that plane that there was something there, and object on the radar. So there are even stronger sort of indications, some kind of physical synchronistic events with the UFO phenomenon. John Mack, recently did some extensive study and almost got fired from Harvard for that.
There's a question back here in the front row.
Alan Silas, you didn't mention hypnosis as a method
Sorry,
of inducing a holotropic state.
was supposed to be there, yes. Sorry.
The method is not many psychiatrists use, unfortunately.
No. I actually, if I would look at my notes, I'm sure I had a little outline which will... Well, I talked about the different spiritual practice that was developed within the systems of yoga. This would include, of course, meditation, concentration, movement, meditation.
Do you see any differences between those which are used through outer practices for ingestion of substances, for example, holotropic breathing and so forth, versus those which are where the body basically quiesces, where there are no substances?
Could you use microphone, please?
The question had to do with whether or not the states of consciousness, the holotropic states, which are induced, say, through meditational practice, without the ingestion of substances or extraordinary outer activities, whether those lead you to the same state of consciousness or with the same kind of self-awareness during that state. In other words, is there any difference in your mind?
Has been a long discussion about the mystical experience induced by psychedelics, to what extent it's equivalent, to what extent it's equally valid. And there basically have been three different opinions. One was the strictly scientific, materialistic one, saying, well, we have now substances where we can induce these states that they call mystical, which means there's nothing like mysticism, there's no spiritual, there's not a genuine dimension, it's all brain, physiology, brain, biochemistry, and these are just misnomers or misinterpretations of unusual phenomena in the brain. The second school was saying, no, we have now a subgroup of substances that can produce mystical experiences, so these are special substances, and we'll call them sacraments, which is pretty much what the shamans of the different psychedelic cultures do. And the third one was pretty much agreement, not just phenomenologically, but in the study that Walter Pankey did, the so-called Good Friday experiment, where he gave, I don't remember the number, it was a group of theologians, students of theology, who got psilocybin, and control group they got niacin, so they can experience something. And then he used a questionnaire which was developed from mystical literature, and he found that these experiences that they had with psilocybin were indistinguishable from those that you read about. I certainly would not be able to distinguish my psychedelic experiences from the experiences that I read about. So with this last group, phenomenologically they seem to be the same, but there was a group of people who were now saying, well, they might appear to be the same, but for it to be real spiritual experience, it has to come as a result of practice, ascetic practice, or it has to come as grace. You cannot force it by a chemical. Meher Baba was in that group. And other people, like a lot of the Tibetans, I actually given LSD to several of the Tibetan masters. they said this was an accelerator of practice that has to be very powerful, has to be used very carefully, but they saw it as something that could be an integral part of spiritual practice. So there are these different opinions.
One last question.
Okay.
Hannah Reeve. I'd like to make a comment here on what you've just said, which partially answers a question I'm going to put to you. In the spiritual tradition, the value is put on self-development, integration, soul-centered consciousness or higher-centered consciousness, where one becomes a master of the self and then is involved in altered state of consciousness in self-mastery. If we induce that altered state through the use of psychedelic drugs or artificially, and the person hasn't developed that integration, there are huge risks there. And also, because there are so many levels of consciousness that we can reach, what we may think is spiritual may just be a psychic domain and may not actually be informative. It gives us a phenomenal experience without the truth and the information that would impact on our consciousness, because we're actually in touch with a principle. It is the principles that we need to be in touch with in order to act safely within those dimensions. They need to be embodied within our soul consciousness. I personally see that there's a distinction between artificial inducement and personality-centered consciousness, or self-mastery and soul-centered consciousness. I would see it in those distinctions. You gave us a very interesting talk and drew our attention to so many things, and your research is so wide. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can I answer? I think I found it difficult to distinguish between what is artificial and what is not. Because, for example, you look at the desert fathers who spent 6 weeks in the desert, dehydrated, sleep deprived. That's are major changes in the body chemistry as well. On the other hand, it's very difficult to find any specific effects of something like LSD. I actually spent a lot of time trying to find what has to happen when you give LSD, and for a while I thought it must be the dilation of pupils, and then I saw some powerful experiences where the pupils were constricted. So it's really a catalyst. It's very difficult in the dosages which are used to find any specific effects. And what you're saying is certainly would be seen in certain traditions, but you have many cultures, psychedelic cultures, for whom the psychedelic plants are the sacrament. They don't know anything else. For them, that's the religion. But unlike people in our culture, they are living in a situation where the cosmology, the philosophy, the mythology of the culture comes out of those states. And when they have those experiences, they're connecting with the culture around them. Whereas people in our culture who have these experiences, they become alienated. They're suddenly in a totally different space, because the worldview that's coming out of these states is incompatible with the world that we have in our culture. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Like a number of people here, it seems, Charlie started out in life studying electrical engineering. Unlike some of us, he didn't have to go through a major traumatic experience in his life to get off on a new course. It seems to have always been there in the background. And he got his PhD from the University of North Carolina in 1963, and immediately went to Stanford University, which is where I was teaching at the time, and joined with Professor Ernest Hilgard there in the hypnosis laboratory. And the younger members of the audience may not remember that to study hypnosis in a university was a very daring thing back at that time. And so Charlie was already way out on the fringes. Professor Hilgard, he told me later, warned him. One of the first warnings that he got on the campus was to beware of this wild man over in the electrical engineering department named Willis Harmon, who was involved with some even farther out things, at least in his estimation. So that was how we met. That was very tantalizing to Charlie, so he didn't waste any time coming over to get acquainted. And then after a couple of years there, he went to the University of California at Davis. And the University of California is a tremendous university system. 9 campuses, 5 hospitals, a host of research laboratories of various sizes, something over 100,000 people altogether. And in all of that complex, as far as I've been able to make out, Charlie Tart was the only person who ever raised these important questions, at least publicly. So he was a professor of psychology, but persisted in raising the questions and the issues that were considered somewhat outside the mainstream at the time. So as early as 1969, he had published his book on altered states, his first one. And then a couple of years later, he published a very significant paper on state-specific sciences, the general idea that the science as viewed from the ground level is not really going to be adequate for accounting for all of human experience. That idea has been picked up by various other... Charlie gives other people courage to talk about some of these things, and sometimes he gives us a nice term. For example, he introduced the term consensus trance to remind us of how we're totally hypnotized by our scientifically oriented culture, and so we tend not even to see certain kinds of phenomena that occur in other cultures all the time, or if we do see them, we consider them to be anomalies and great puzzles. And so the whole idea that the modern society could be in a collective trance state, viewing the world in a particular way, but not necessarily a uniquely correct way, as contrasted with all of those pre-scientific societies. That was a pretty daring concept, and again, he gave the term consensus trance, and people felt more comfortable thinking that way after he gave a name to it. Then in the early 1970s, he published 2 significant books, one on transpersonal psychologies and another on states of consciousness. And then in the late 1980s, he published a book on Gurdjieffian work, which he entitled Waking Up, which is an excellent personal self-help book. His more recent book, Living the Mindful Life, is another, perhaps in the same category. Charlie's present institutional connections are a professor at the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology and a research fellow at the California Institute of Integral Studies and research fellow with the Institute of Noetic Sciences. And he tells me that he plans to, that he has another book in preparation, which is called Parapsychology Spirituality. Watch for it, ask your local book dealer. And that he really aspires to take on Daniel Dennett and instead of Consciousness Explained, to write a book entitled Consciousness Explored. He hasn't started the outline of that yet. Well, we started the conference by raising the question, do we need a new epistemology? And Charlie Tart is already using one, so we'll let him tell you about it. Please welcome Charlie Tart.
Well, thank you for that exciting welcome. I'm very excited to be here. This is a quite marvelous conference and a pioneering conference. I've heard so many stimulating papers in the last couple of days, and it's very gratifying to me because I've always believed that science and psychology in particular should be comprehensive and should take account of all aspects of human consciousness, not just those that happen to be fashionable at the moment. And all through my career in psychology, I've noticed how certain things were out of fashion. I did a lot of research in hypnosis in the early part of my career, for instance, in which, through the act of speaking with someone for half an hour, I could sometimes totally change their reality and produce these massive changes. And psychology almost totally ignored this sort of thing. I couldn't understand how such powerful effects could be ignored. So I've explored a variety of unfashionable phenomena. Willis has mentioned some of them, things like hypnosis and dreams, altered states in general, meditation, the human potential movement, biofeedback, parapsychology. Many of these are almost moving into the mainstream now, and that's very gratifying. What I'm going to focus on today is one that is not represented in the mainstream at all, but which I think is vitally important, to which I'll call enlightenment. Now, for the moment, I'll avoid defining what I mean by enlightenment. I actually can't do it anyway, but we'll pretend I can define it later. And try to share some preliminary understandings about it. I'm not going to explain consciousness, but if I can expand our concept of what consciousness is, I'll feel very happy. We can't explain it, of course, but it's great fun to try. Enlightenment is a major psychological goal of hundreds of millions of people on this planet. But of course, they're Easterners, not us, and so we pay no attention to them. Our own cultural limitations make science and psychology almost blind to questions about enlightenment. You won't find enlightenment, for instance, mentioned at all in introductory psychology texts. I always find it interesting once in a while to scan the indexes of introductory psychology texts to see what the field is about, and particularly the entries that aren't there. Wisdom, things like that. We have some small exceptions in humanistic and transpersonal psychology, but these are still very small parts of the total psychological enterprise. I find this lack of interest in or knowledge about enlightenment in psychology ironic, because in a strange sort of way, I find that modern psychology probably knows more about the obstacles to enlightenment than the spiritual enlightenment traditions do. I've sometimes expressed this as in modern psychology we have a profound knowledge of endarkenment. And I can certainly claim that personally. I don't really know what enlightenment is, but personally and professionally I've studied and practiced endarkenment for more than 50 years now and claim considerable expertise on the topic. Nevertheless, I'll have the presumption to try to present something about the enlightenment perspective on life. And to introduce that, you might say that from the perspective of the Enlightenment traditions, our ordinary consciousness is highly restricted. In a very real sense, we are prisoners in a very constricted subset of what could be. And while we have some very powerful techniques in modern psychology, rather than using them to further enlightenment, which is possible, we use them to decorate our prison cells and make things much more comfortable here. But from the Enlightenment perspective, I do believe that modern psychological knowledge could help us to move in the direction of enlightenment. All right, what am I going to talk about now? After I'd been teaching at the University of California for about 20 years, the administration one day sent around a little sheet called How to Teach. I thought it was about time. I'd sort of been faking it since then. It was good to get it proper instructions. And they did have one excellent hint there. They said it's a good idea to outline where you're going to go so people don't lose the woods for the interesting trees. So I'll give you a brief outline of what we're going to cover. Okay? I will first attempt an initial definition of what enlightenment is, primarily through giving you an example of an enlightenment experience. Unfortunately, not mine. Then I'm going to try to make conscious some of the assumptions I'm making in approaching this topic. I've always been very concerned with the assumptions we don't know we make, but which nevertheless color the way we approach things. And then I'm going to move into a sort of a diagnostic mode and ask the question, why do we suffer? And I'll ask it and give a partial answer first from the perspective of the traditions that emphasize enlightenment. And then I'll ask that same question of why we suffer from a modern psychological perspective, which can illuminate the enlightenment perspective. We'll probably be fairly depressed by then, so at that point I will move into try to talk about what enlightenment is like or what it's about. And I can't really define it, but I can point toward it with some experiences. And if time allows, I'll try to talk to some degree about how do we move in the direction of enlightenment and where can modern psychology fit in with this. So my goal then is not to explain anything, but to try to expand our openness toward a vitally important area of reality and an area, enlightenment, that I think is indeed beyond the brain in a real, not just a psychological sense. I won't have time to get into that aspect of it, but what I'll be talking about, I don't believe, is simply a certain kind of brain state. All right, so we're all well-trained as intellectuals, so we know we have to define our terms to begin with. So, right, I thought if I'm going to talk about enlightenment, and I'm a psychologist, I'll go to the Encyclopedic Dictionary of Psychology, which is on my shelves, I believe published by Oxford University Press. See what it said about enlightenment, and there was no entry. So that takes care of the regular psychological definition of enlightenment. Well, I thought, let me go back into something closer to the real world, and pulled out my copy of Webster's New Collegiate Dictionary, and I found enlightenment. 1, the act or means of enlightening, the state of being enlightened. Well, that's nice. It doesn't tell us anything, but that's nice. 2, enlightenment with a capital E, a philosophic movement of the 18th century, marked by questioning of traditional doctrines and values, a tendency toward individualism, and an emphasis on the idea of universal human progress, the empirical method in science, and the free use of reason. I thought, well, that's not what I planned to talk about, but that's certainly compatible. So that's all right. Although the individualism's a little funny there. And 3, enlightenment in Buddhism, a final blessed state marked by the absence of desire or suffering. I thought about that, and that sounds like you're dead. That's not quite an adequate definition of either. And besides, as I understand it, it's not an absence of desire, it's an absence of attachment to desire, which is quite different. Now, as you all realize, enlightenment is inherently undefinable. Enlightenment is about a radical change in not only your consciousness, but your whole state of being. But when we try to define something, our ability to define, to use words, is a part of the whole vast spectrum of what our totality as human beings are. I have never expected the part to be able to define the whole. And it always puzzles me when people seem to drive themselves mad because they can't define something adequately, as if we then can't deal with the reality of it. I'm not bothered by that. To me, words are a convenient way of pointing toward realities, and if we can point carefully and accurately, that's fine. Now, of course, that's difficult. I mean, for instance, many times I've told my cat, look over there, and if my cat pays attention at all, he stares at my finger. So words do tend to trap us. Instead of looking in the direction the words point, we get caught up in the words themselves. For those of you who want it fancier, I think you could invoke Gödel's theorem to show that the part can never be explained in its own terms. So I'll try to carefully use my words today, but the words I'll use are intended to be pointers. If they point to something that you have some experiential understanding of and lead you to make some useful connections, good. If you get caught in the words, that's dangerous. As we all know, of course, this topic of enlightenment has a great deal of nonsense around it and psychopathology around it and sheer plain craziness. But there's nothing unique about that. All areas of life have pathology and craziness mixed in with them. So we won't worry about that. So I'm going to try to focus today on what is enlightenment, and I'll try to share some essence of the phenomena here. I'll begin by giving you an example of a spontaneous enlightenment experience. Peter Fenner gave us a marvelous one in that videotape yesterday. I was very pleased to see that. I'm going to give you one that is more detailed in a way and will illustrate enlightenment, one sense of the word, as a special altered state of consciousness that's extremely important. The examples I'll give you today, I'm deliberately not drawing from the spiritual traditions. The spiritual traditions I have enormous respect for, but they also have an investment in a certain conceptual system. So I'm going to try to draw my examples from people who had no a priori beliefs about enlightenment, who have less investment in trying to make it sound as if it conforms to a certain kind of doctrine. The example I'm going to give you today is from an anesthesiologist.
At the time this experience happened, he was, in his more angrier moments, a rather militant atheist. What was all that nonsense they poured into him as a child that made him feel guilty? But most of the time he basically didn't give a damn one way or the other about anything spiritual. He was a young professional, a professor, had a lot of research grants, rising very rapidly in his career, was clearly going to be offered tenure. And this experience so affected him that instead of going on and getting tenure, which is the supreme plum for academics, he gave it up so he would have more time to explore his own mind. This is a big effect. This is a fairly precise description of the experience. One of the reasons it's precise is when I first met him, I said, "You've got to write this up." Because he had also had some experiences with psychedelics afterwards, and I said, you know, there's a literature arguing whether psychedelics can induce genuine mystical experiences or not, and by and large it's a classic case of the blind leading the blind. The arguments are by people who've never had a spontaneous mystical experience or a psychedelic experience arguing about what's real. He had had both. So he insisted that I work with him, and I keep pressing him on what exactly do you mean by so-and-so. So there's quite a bit of precision in here. Dr. S, as I'll call him, he's not quite ready to come out of the closet, but almost. He says, my cosmic consciousness event, that's how he chooses to describe this, and some of you will know that term, occurred unexpectedly while I was alone one evening and watching a particularly beautiful sunset. The experience began with some mild tingling in the perineal area between the genitals and anus. The feeling was unusual, but was neither particularly pleasant nor unpleasant. After the initial few minutes, I either ceased to notice the tingling or did not remember it. I then noticed that the level of light in the room, as well as that of the sky outside, seemed to be increasing slowly. The light seemed to be coming from everywhere, not only from the waning sun. In fact, the sun itself did not give off a strong glare. The light gave the air a bright, thickened quality that slightly obscured perception rather than sharpened it. It soon became extremely bright, but the light was not in the least unpleasant. Along with the light came an alteration in mood. I began to feel very good, then better still, then elated. While this was happening, the passage of time seemed to become slower and slower. The brightness, mood elevation, and time slowing all progressed together. This is where I question him and try to get the correlations here. It's difficult to estimate the time period over which these changes occurred, since the sense of time was itself affected. However, there was a feeling of continuous change rather than a discrete jump or jumps to a new state. Eventually, the sense of time passing stopped entirely. It's difficult to describe this feeling, but perhaps it would be better to say that there was no time or no sense of time. Only the present moment existed. My elation proceeded to an ecstatic state, the intensity of which I have never even imagined could be possible. The colorless white light around me merged with the reddish light of the sunset to become one all-enveloping, intense light field. Perception of other things faded. At this point, I merged with the light, and everything, including myself, became one unified whole. There was no separation between myself and the rest of the universe. In fact, to say that there was a universe, a self, or anything would be misleading. It would be an equally correct description to say that there was nothing as to say that there was everything. To say that subject merged with object might be almost adequate as a description to the entrance to cosmic consciousness, but during cosmic consciousness there are no subject and object. All words or discursive thinking had stopped, and there was no sense of an observer to comment or categorize on what was, quote, happening, or rather, inverted commas, happening. I have to get the language there. In fact, there were no discrete events to happen, just a timeless unitary sense of being. It goes on to say that cosmic consciousness is impossible to describe, partly because describing involves words, and the state is one in which there are no words. My attempts at description here originated from reflecting on cosmic consciousness soon after it had passed, and while there was still some taste of the event remaining. Perhaps the most significant element of cosmic consciousness was the absolute knowingness that it involves. This knowingness is a deep understanding that occurs without words. I was certain that the universe was one whole, and that it was benign and loving at its ground. The benign nature and ground of being with which I was united was God.
However, there is little relation between my experience of God as ground of being and the anthropomorphic concept of God from the Bible. That God is separate from the world and has many human characteristics. He demonstrates love, anger, and vengeance, makes demands, gives reward, punishes, forgives, etc. God is experienced in cosmic consciousness as the very ground or beingness of the universe and has no human characteristics in the usual sense of the word. The universe could no more be separate from God than my body could be separate from its cells. Moreover, the only emotion that I would associate with God is love, but it would be more accurate to say that God is love than that God is loving. Again, characterizing God as love and the ground of being is only a metaphor, but it's the best I can do to describe an indescribable experience. The knowingness of cosmic consciousness permanently convinced me about the true nature of the universe. However, it did not answer many of the questions that, quite rightly, seem so important to us in our usual state of consciousness. From the perspective of cosmic consciousness, questions like, what is the purpose of life, or is there an afterlife, are not answered because they're not relevant. That is, during cosmic consciousness, ontologic questions are fully answered by one state of being, and verbal questions are not to the point. Eventually, the cosmic consciousness faded. The time changes, light and mood elevation passed off. When I was able to think again, the sun had set, and I estimate that the event must have lasted about 20 minutes. I would say this is beyond ordinary consciousness. Now, let me tell you the assumptions I'm making in approaching this subject, and also to point out that they are assumptions from the perspective of our ordinary state of consciousness, but they are testable from various altered states of consciousness. So they don't necessarily have to remain assumptions, even though for those of us who haven't experienced this, they remain assumptions. The fact that these assumptions are testable is quite important to me. For all my interest in spiritual things, which is very deep, I really like science and think it's useful. But I think the approach to enlightenment that I'm giving here is totally compatible with science. Let me give you a quote from an early psychologist who was quite interested in the psychology of motivation, Gautama Buddha. He said, "Do not believe in anything simply because you have heard it. Do not believe in traditions because they have been handed down for many generations. Do not believe in anything because it is spoken and rumored by many. Do not believe in anything because it is found written in your religious books. Do not believe in anything merely on the authority of your teachers and elders. But after observation and analysis, when you find that anything agrees with reason and is conducive to the good and benefit of one and all, then accept it and live up to it." I can go with that, and I think that's a perfectly scientific attitude. Now, the fact that these assumptions that I'm approaching are testable is very important, because enlightenment, as I'm going to present it, is not about blind belief. It's not about how you can't use your mind and must believe something, whether it's contradictory or not. There's lots of blind belief around, of course, in the scientific enterprise as well as in other areas. But these assumptions are compatible with a basic scientific approach. They're not compatible with what sociologists have called scientism, where the current physical findings of science are taken as the absolute answer and must be protected from heresy. But I have no concern with being compatible with scientism. So the assumptions. The first one is that our everyday consciousness is a subset of all the possibilities. This is what I've technically referred to as consensus consciousness, because the way our individual minds work is strongly reflective of the consensus of what our culture has taught us is real. The second assumption is like the first, but it brings in a certain value judgment, and that is that everyday consciousness is shrunken or contracted or a distorted version of the whole possibilities of human consciousness. And this is where I use the term that Willis mentioned of consensus trance, when I deliberately intended in a pejorative kind of way. That this shrunken version of our possible consciousness, this consensus trance, does indeed imply a certain dullness, ignorance, suffering, lack of will, and so forth. Now, what do I mean by this? Let me give you a parallel with some of the hypnosis experiments that we did routinely in the laboratory many years ago. We could take a person and hypnotize them and tell them, you can't bend your arm. No matter how hard you try, you can't bend it. And for many people, they would then struggle and struggle, and they could not bend their arm. Now, if I tell you you can't bend your arm now, you can just bend it. But in the further constricted hypnotic state that we set up deliberately in the laboratory, a person did not have all of their capacities available, and they could indeed not bend their arm. There was a certain sense in which they accepted the suggested reality at face value instead of remembering a larger reality. Now, that problem of being unable to bend your arm could be solved by the almighty hypnotist giving a suggestion that now you could, or by coming out of hypnosis, in which case the problem ceased to exist. A traditional analogy used in the spiritual traditions about analogy is that ordinary consensus consciousness is really like being in a nighttime dream. Okay, now there are many good things about dreams, but in a certain sense, in a dream, compared to your waking state, you have reduced intelligence, you don't have all of your knowledge available, you have reduced volition and so forth. And so a lot of times we suffer in a dream trying to do something that in ordinary life we could handle that problem quite easily. There'd be nothing to it. And also in a nighttime dream, we are generally ignorant of our real condition, namely that we're asleep and dreaming. We think we're in a world. Again, by waking up to ordinary consciousness, the dream problems disappear. The Enlightenment traditions make a similar claim, that if we could genuinely wake up from that perspective, we would realize that now we are in a dreamlike condition of consensus trance. And as Dr. S's experience illustrated, many things that seem to be major problems would simply cease to be problems from that other state of being. So those are my assumptions. Now, let's ask the question, why do we suffer? From the Enlightenment perspective, again, quoting that old motivational psychologist Gautama Buddha, he put it down as 4 noble truths why we suffer. His first noble truth was the reality of suffering. I've never heard anyone quarrel with that and say, no, we never suffer. So that's sort of a universal truth. And then his second noble truth was the good news that suffering can be overcome. His third was an analysis of the causes of suffering. And his fourth was a set of practices for overcoming suffering. Now, what did he mean by suffering? He gave 3 major causes for suffering. The first of these was ignorance. Now, ignorance here in 2 senses. One, the ordinary sense. If you don't know how to fix a flat tire and you get a flat tire in your car, you're going to suffer while you wait for someone else to do it. Whereas if you knew how to do it, you were in a hurry to get somewhere, you could avoid that suffering. That kind of ignorance is handled through education. And we are actually quite good in the West at dealing with that kind of ignorance. But the Buddha was primarily focusing on a much more profound ignorance, and that's an ignorance of who we really are. Or, since he was fond of negatives, perhaps who we really are not. That we have a transpersonal nature. There is something about us that is infinitely more vast than the usual ordinary self, and we're ignorant of that. Because we're ignorant of that, we give our energy, we give our volition, we give our belief to something that's too limited. The common belief that we give, the common 2 beliefs that we give our energy to is that our physical body is all there is to us, and or that our ordinary personality is all there is to us. In fact, I particularly like Gurdjieff's term, false personality, because this personality was itself caused by many things we had no control over, rather than being a real choice. So we have a fundamental ignorance, and so we identify with our body and with our false personality. Well, once you do that, as that's all of the important things in life, certain things follow naturally. This body is quite vulnerable to injury, to suffering, to death. So clearly one of my major jobs in life is to protect this body from suffering and death. My false personality is also susceptible to injury. Someone might look at me and frown and I would be hurt. I've got to do things to make people approve of me. As a result of this identification with the narrow, as a result of this ignorance of our true nature, according to the Buddha, we then spend our lives between the twin poles of grasping and attachment. On the other hand, anything that protects me in some sense or makes me happy, I want more of it. I need it. I got to hold on to it. I've got to grasp it. Anything that threatens my personality or my body, I've got to push it away. I develop aversions to it. And life is a constant oscillation between these 2 things, grasping and aversion within a context of fundamental ignorance. So from the Buddha's analysis, the dynamics of consensus consciousness are based on ignorance, grasping, and aversion. and they lead to a distorted perception of our own being, of other people, and of the world around us. Now, I'm going to slide over the distorted part in a moment, because when I talk about this from a more modern psychological perspective, I think that can become clearer. So the Buddhists, for instance, took an idea which was also available in Hinduism, that we live in illusion. Samsara is the term for it, usually translated as meaning that the world is not real, but that's not the main point. It's not that the world isn't real. It's that our perception of the world is so badly distorted that the experiential world we live in is an illusion, is very much not the real world. As a result of living in illusion, you suffer. If you have an illusion about what somebody else wants from you, you give them the wrong thing, they resent it, and so things go on and on and on from there. Tibetan Buddhists also have a nice term for ordinary consciousness. They talk about ordinary consciousness as being a fabricated state. And fabrication can be looked at in two senses here. One, fabrication simply in the sense of manufacturing. We do a lot of work to create our ordinary consciousness. Even though we're so used to it, we don't notice it. But also fabrication in the sense of lying, in the sense of making things up. Now, let's look at this same question, why do we suffer, from a modern psychological perspective. Starting with what we know about neurophysiology. Whatever you believe consciousness ultimately is, whether you think it's an epiphenomena, whether you think it's something quite different from brain in some ultimate sense, which is the direction I tend in. I'm a pragmatic dualist, but that's not relevant now. Whatever you think consciousness ultimately is, it's clear that it's intimately involved with the brain and the nervous system. It's like each one of us was given this personal computer at birth, and our eyes are glued to the screen. So the programs in that computer are going to have a major effect on what we can see. So we know, for instance, that what we see in a very literal sense is very much a result of processing within the nervous system. The fact that we see the colors that we see is a function of the way the eye is constructed. The fact that we hear sounds is a function of the way the ear and the brain is constructed. The fact that, for instance, that we see separate people in this room is a function of the nervous system. If you could see the visual field simply as the light patterns that actually reach your eyes, things would be very blurry and colorful. But the brain artificially uses a process called lateral inhibition to sharpen visual impressions up. Engineers call it edge detection. It makes edges sharper in your perception than they actually are, which is very handy for separating one object from another instead of having things blur together. So consciousness, in some sense, as we ordinarily experience it, is very much controlled by the functioning of the brain, and those aspects you can't do much about. But we know psychologically that what you perceive is also controlled by, for example, your desires, your fears, your defense mechanisms, your cultural biases to readily see certain things and not notice other kinds of things. Those things are potentially changeable. Years ago in 1975, I came up with a systems approach to try to understand both ordinary consensus consciousness and various altered states of consciousness. And I've now been expanding that to use a wonderful model that's come along to show what ordinary consciousness is like. And this is the model of computer-generated virtual reality, which has been briefly mentioned by a couple of speakers. You put on a pair of goggles so that a computer controls the images you see. There's a little sensor on your head that tells the computer when you look up or down or turn your head, the picture is adjusted accordingly. Well, when a picture changes according to what you perceive as your head movements, the brain very quickly says you're looking at reality. There is a little sensor on your hand that says, where's the hand? Is it grasping? Is it opening up? Is it moving up, down, turning over? You see a computer-generated hand that moves as you feel your hand move. Well, the brain has a very simple rule, I think, built into it at a very deep level. If something moves with you and your intention, it is you. That's why you're so upset if someone runs into your car when you're driving it. There's a very real sense in which our body image goes between all four fenders when we're driving. I have taken this analogy, and it's very easy to get totally caught up in the reality of these computer-generated virtual realities. But it's made me realize that we already know all about virtual reality. We live in one, what I've called a biopsycho, a biological, psychological virtual reality. Information is coming into our senses, but our neural processes are constructing a reality. In fact, the best example of that reality is when you dream at night. When you dream at night, you're in a world. For those of us who are rich dreamers, that world has all the rich characteristics of ordinary reality. What we experience in a dream in a formal sense is the world simulator, the biopsycho-virtual reality running, the same as we do in our waking state, except that in our waking state, a world is not only being created, a play is not only being put on in an internal theater, but there's massive sensory input from the outside which we must conform with. So that even though right at this moment there's a sense in which each one of us lives inside this virtual reality, this simulation must take good physical account of sensory input. If it doesn't, you die. If your virtual reality says there is no cliff there, everything is wonderful, and you walk forward, you die and don't get to reproduce. So there's definite evolutionary selection for this internal simulation must match the external reality quite well. But here's the funny thing. Most of us do not spend most of our time and energy dealing simply with the physical world. Most of our time and energy is spent in a social reality. And things are much more arbitrary here and much less obvious. Let me give you an example. Some years ago, I was giving a talk in the Midwest, and 5 minutes into my lecture, I happened to look back, and I saw a woman who looked just like my mother. Now, my mother, bless her soul, she was quite wonderful, but she did not share my interests, and I never talked too much about them because I knew she wouldn't approve. Well, I mean, intellectually I knew this couldn't possibly be my mother. She would never fly halfway across the country to watch me give a lecture. But it looked an awful lot like her, and she was frowning. And she frowned throughout that lecture. And this automatic simulation part of my mind just went into overdrive. She's found out, she knows, she doesn't approve, I've been bad. It took a great deal of willpower to don't look in that direction, anywhere but there, you know. No matter how much I knew intellectually, it couldn't be my mother. Oh, God, she's found me out. We live in a social reality where our simulation, our internal representation is often badly distorted. This is why the Buddha talked about suffering arising from living in samsara, suffering arising from living in this simulation. We're too good at simulation. The simulation can be so real that, this is what we know from a modern psychological perspective, that we get lots of satisfaction from it. And so when external reality is not making us happy, it's easy to gild the lily, as it were, to create an internal simulation which we immediately mistake for reality that makes it better, that makes it more satisfying. If this were an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, I would introduce myself by saying, "Hi, my name is Charlie. My drug of choice is thoughts. I get drunk on thoughts. I love them. They drive my system." It's a common disease in the academic world, I'm afraid, and very difficult to get off of. I try to remain sober, but it's not easy. We have the ability to create what in one sense are imaginary representations, but which seem as real as most perceptions, that produce all sorts of internal satisfaction. And that tunes us out from the reality of what's actually going on external to us, and in a very real sense from the transpersonal reality, the greater reality of who we really are. This is why consciousness is a fabrication in the Tibetan sense, why we live in this biopsycho-virtual reality, which is very good and very useful in some ways, very badly distorted in other ways, and unfortunately many of the ways in which it's badly distorted are normal. Everybody else is crazy in the same way, so we reinforce each other. Well, I won't go into more detail on this, I'd love to, but this is fleshed out in my Waking Up or Living the Mindful Life books. As I said earlier, we're probably getting a little depressed by now, even though I've tried to keep it light. So let's talk about enlightenment, which is my main focus here. We've looked at endarkenment and gotten our baseline. I can't really define enlightenment. I'm going to illustrate it, and I'm going to make one distinction, or rather set out a continuum with respect to enlightenment. On the one hand, when the term enlightenment is referring to special altered states of consciousness which nevertheless are transitory. They may have some after effects, but there's an intense experience which largely fades, versus the use of enlightenment in the sense of a permanent change in the nature of your being. To illustrate the altered states with some after effects thing, I would now want to read you the classic description of cosmic consciousness by the man who coined the term cosmic consciousness. And you'll see some fascinating parallels with Dr. S.'s experience a century later. The man who coined the term was a 19th century physician, Richard Maurice Buck. This came on him quite unexpectedly. He wanted to be objective about it. And now he was caught up in the scientific fashions of his time, so he thought the best way to be objective is to describe it in the third person as if it happened to someone else. I wish objectivity were so easily guaranteed. So let me read you this wonderful description there. He says, it was in the early spring at the beginning of his 36th year. He and two friends had spent the evening reading Wordsworth, Shelley, Keats, Browning, and especially Whitman. It's the way we all spend our evenings, of course. Not watching the telly, but doing that sort of thing. They parted at midnight, and he had a long drive in a hansom cab. He was in England at the time. His mind, deeply under the influences of the ideas, images, and emotions called up by the reading and talk of the evening, was calm and peaceful. He was in a state of quiet, almost passive enjoyment. All at once, without any warning of any kind, he found himself wrapped around, as it were, by a flame-colored cloud. For an instant he thought of fire, some sudden conflagration in the great city. The next he knew the light was within himself. Directly afterwards came upon him a sense of exultation, of immense joyousness, accompanied or immediately followed by an intellectual illumination quite impossible to describe. Into his brain streamed, he believed in the brain, of course, as so many people do now. Into his brain streamed one momentary lightning flash of the Brahmic splendor which has ever since lightened his life. Upon his heart fell one drop of Brahmic bliss, leaving thenceforward for always an aftertaste of heaven. Among other things, he saw and knew that the cosmos is not dead matter, but a living presence, that the soul of man is immortal, that the universe is so built and ordered that without any peradventure all things work together for the good of each and all, that the foundation principle of the world is what we call love, and that the happiness of everyone is, in the long run, absolutely certain. He claims that he learned more within the few seconds during which the illumination lasted than in previous months or even years of study, and that he learned much that no study could ever have taught. The illumination itself continued not more than a few moments, but its effects proved ineffable. It was impossible for him to ever forget what he at that time saw and knew. Neither did he, nor could he, ever doubt the truth of what was then presented to his mind. Again, the videotape that Peter Fenner showed earlier also brings the flavor of this, and hopefully the accounts convey a certain flavor and point at something that may resonate in your memory. I must say, incidentally, a colleague of mine who heard me give a preliminary version of this said, "Why do you give such wonderful accounts that seem so far from us? Why don't you just talk about what us ordinary folks can do?" Well, I've decided to try to be inspirational, and this is not necessarily beyond what we can do, and points in a direction. Besides, it's Sunday morning, and there's supposed to be a sermon, isn't there? Anyway. Now, let me try to illustrate the other end of this spectrum of enlightenment experiences, where the emphasis is not so much on an altered state of consciousness, a flash that then fades, but on a permanent change of being. And to draw on this, again, from a source totally devoid of any traditional spiritual background, I want to tell you the effects or the experiences of a retired mathematical physicist, a Briton by the name of John Wren Lewis. Some of you may have heard of him. His wife, Anne Faraday, wrote some wonderful and highly popular books on dreams some years ago. John was not at all interested in mystical, schmystical, weirdo kinds of stuff. My wife Judy and I had the pleasure of having dinner with him and his wife because of our mutual interest in dreams some years before his enlightenment experience. And at that time we noted that John was a wonderful and fellow, very polite to his wife's weird friends, but clearly had no interest whatsoever in this kind of material. John and Anne were in Thailand researching material on the Senoi, the tribe that was written up in my Altered States of Consciousness book that's allegedly had this wonderful system for working with dreams in the morning and inducing lucid dreams and the like. It's a very interesting thing. Those of you who've read it, it's now clear that this is fictional. There were never really a people who did all those things. Nevertheless, it's true because if you believe it and try those things, it works. Anyway, they had come out of spending a year in the jungles doing this and were catching a bus, and a nice young man helped them with their luggage, got on the bus with them, and offered them some candy, some Cadbury's chocolates, I believe. Anne didn't eat hers. It smelled a little musty, but John wanted to be polite and ate his. And the bus went on, and John was tired and fell asleep. And then he began turning blue, and Anne realized this was not normal. And there's a long, complex story of how she barely managed to get him to a hospital in time, and with lots of drugs, they managed to keep him from dying. He probably was clinically dead, but, you know, in situations like that, the effort is on resuscitation, not on seeing if someone has just crossed the line or not. And besides, we know in a near-death experience, the very fact that they're near means you're not really, 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 really dead. But anyway, apparently he was given a massive dose of morphine mixed with cocaine, which is commonly used by robbers in Thailand, apparently to knock tourists out so their luggage can be stolen, and they get the dose wrong sometimes. John's experiences are going to be very inspiring, but I don't recommend the method. The near part is very tricky. Most people who come this near do not tell you about interesting experiences. They get buried. I had the pleasure of spending a couple of weeks with John and Anne, both my wife and I, in Australia a couple of years ago. So I was able to talk to him at length about what had happened with him. This man is quite genuine, and what has happened to him is very interesting. And as I say, he has no doctrine to uphold, so he's quite open about this. He first discovered that something was different approximately half an hour after he had finally recovered in the hospital. For the first half hour, he was too distracted to notice that anything was different. They were running tests on him and asking him about his condition and all that. And finally, they decided he was all right and left him alone, and he didn't fall asleep, and he began to notice this quite beautiful hospital room he was in, which he realized logically, beautiful hospital room? Not likely. Here's his initial description of his discovery of the state of consciousness he was in, which has become a permanent state of consciousness. Okay? He said, in visual terms, everything was highlighted, though in this case the effect was more than visual, somehow seeming to include the other senses too, as with the smell of the toilet, the buzzing of the insects, and the touch of the bed sheets. And it was more than merely sensuous. It was like the sheer isness of each thing standing out as a kind of greeting. The radiant I'm reading from a book that he is now looking for a publisher for, so hopefully it will come out within a year, called The 9:15 to Nirvana, named after the bus schedule that began all this. The radiant blackness of being, okay? Most people talk about the light after a near-death experience. He feels something more profound behind the light was part of his experience. You'll get the flavor from it as I talk about it and use the phrase darkness. The radiant blackness of being at the back of my head, recognizing and saluting itself, or rather its no-self, in each other thing, both the objects and events of the outer universe and the thoughts, feelings, sensationings, and imaginings of John Wren Lewis's personal inner universe. And at the back of my head is no idle figure of speech. The experience was so palpable that I actually put my hand up to my head to check that my skull was still intact. I suddenly felt for all the world as if the doctors had removed the back of that bony shell and somehow exposed my brain to the infinite darkness of space. The openness at the back of my head felt like an enormous liberation, as if I'd had some kind of brain cataract removed, making true perception possible for the first time in my life. I knew what William Blake must really have meant by that famous statement about everything being perceived in its true infinite nature when the doors of perception are cleansed. He thought, must be some kind of drug after effect. although there should have been time for all the drugs to be out of his system by now. Surely it'll go away. It's never gone away, except for a few moments in the last 10 years when he's gotten very distracted. But his normal state is now changed. And it's changed his understanding of things. For instance, the question of death. Fear and horror of death had gone because I was no longer experiencing my aliveness as particularly mine, a property or possession of the individual psychophysiological organism called John Wren Lewis. The perspective was giving a kind of deep, tranquil satisfaction to the mere fact of existence in every moment, which altogether transcended the shallow and transient pleasures of John's personal progression along the timeline. The eternity experience in each moment, that's the flavor of his consciousness now, the eternity experience in each present moment makes the whole issue of possible immortality unimportant, whereas the desire for immortality shows a preoccupation with separate selfhood along the line of time that might very well block the joy and tranquility of eternity experience. He feels a oneness with all life, with all being. It's simply a constant part. I won't take the time to illustrate that. He also realized that what a change in him, and wasn't this supposed to be the exclusive property of really important religious figures? How in the world had it happened to an ordinary person like him? And yet his own direct experience is that there's nothing special about it. He says, yet my experience equally didn't carry the slightest hint of my being anything like a very special person or even a fairly special person. On the contrary, my sense of myself as a focusing down of the one infinite consciousness was simultaneously a sense of everyone else, indeed of everything else, as also that. Even the fact that other people around me seemed unaware of their thatness didn't seem to make me special in any way other than perhaps especially lucky. Now, another classic characteristic associated with enlightenment that he experienced is an inherently compassionate approach to life. Not a feeling that he should be kind and generous and compassionate, but an inherently compassionate approach to life. He began to understand this in a more verbalizable way a couple of weeks later when his wife Anne Faraday became very ill and there was great complications in trying to get her to a hospital in Malaysia. And he didn't notice his changed state for a while. He was simply too busy trying to deal with the emergencies of getting his wife in a hospital. And then he notes that eternity-blind consciousness takes for granted that satisfaction comes to individuals only through getting their personal needs and preferences met, from which it seems to follow that the impulse to help others must depend upon there being some kind of feeling identification with them. The very words compassion and sympathy imply this if taken back to their original common root. From my perspective inside nirvana consciousness, however, the whole situation looks completely different. Eternity's satisfaction automatically flows over into caring energy along the line of time, as the direct expression of eternity's love for time's productions. It is no great effort of renunciation for a mystic actually living in nirvana consciousness to put aside individual comforts and preferences to help someone else, because personal comforts and preferences are only very secondary sources of satisfaction, while helping others in distress is direct participation in the ultimate satisfaction, eternity's love for the productions of times. Now, John makes it very clear that he does not want to be regarded as some kind of saint, and that he certainly isn't. You know, he thought there were stereotypes like this. He still enjoys wine and meat. You know, and he doesn't think, you know, he's some marvelous person saving the world. He's just automatically compassionate. And in the various Enlightenment traditions, I find an almost universal message that the highest levels of enlightenment, even though they may include other components, compassion is automatic. In fact, if you have a kind of enlightenment that doesn't include compassion, continue working. You're not there yet. You're seriously distorted in some way. Now, another stereotype that had to fall by the way is one we tend to all have of enlightenment in mystical states, that it changes you into a certain kind of person. The technical term that some Americans have coined for this is that you become a bliss ninny. You sit there in some ecstatic state, which is probably nice for you, but not of much value for the world. On the contrary, John found that, if anything, his effectiveness and intelligence has been increased. I'll give you another example from his book. The day after they got out of the hospital, they needed to get him some rest before they caught the 9:15 again the next day, which was going to have an interesting psychological significance. And they wanted to find a quiet hotel, so they made some inquiries and were recommended a quiet hotel. And unfortunately, as so many Thai hotels, this was basically a house of prostitution and partying, and it wasn't terribly restful. But it led to an interesting experience. The next morning, John came down early before Anne and his daughter were awake to try to arrange some breakfast before they went to the bus station. And John reports that what greeted me between the foot of the stairs and the entrance to the dining room was a huge pool of vomit, presumably evidence of excess at the previous night's revelry. This is good teaching technique now, because this is what's going to fix my talk in your mind as you think about that huge pool of vomit. All right, a huge pool of vomit. I was truly astonished to experience its greeting with as much welcome as that of an Edelweiss. Astonished, for I have been extremely squeamish ever since I can remember as a result of cosseting in infancy by a neurotically hygiene-conscious mother. Now, as the dark confronted me in the pool of vomit, I experienced that ability to enjoy, literally enjoy, contradictory feelings which I'd already recognized as characteristic of mystical consciousness. On the one hand, I saw and smelled particles of semi-digested food mixed with bile fluid, and they were quite fascinating sensations, each giving me greetings as if they were wonderful artworks at whose creation I'd been personally present. And simultaneously, I experienced my disgust reactions, even to the point of my gorge beginning to rise, as itself a creative act of John's body-mind under the direction of his mother's neurotic fears, which was also a marvel. Moreover, deep underneath it, an integral part of the appreciation was the peace-past understanding of complete being. And as I negotiated my way around the pool of divine vomit, I also noted that the new awareness didn't make me in the least careless about getting mess on my shoes. On the contrary, the dark's perspectivizing of my conditioned anxieties allowed much greater efficiency in coping with the purely practical problem of avoiding contamination than would have been possible with gritted teeth. As I've found again and again in the years since then, the practical business of getting good results along the line of time is in no way hindered by mystic awareness that everything is already perfect in the dimension of eternity. Freedom from domination by anxious thought for the morrow actually makes for far greater efficiency in doing. So again, I stress that while there are altered states that may temporarily transform one into a bliss ninny, full enlightenment doesn't seem to involve that. And actually, if you look at history, some of the greatest mystics were extremely effective people in the practical world. So let me summarize some of these qualities of enlightenment that I've tried to illustrate here in expanding our perspective. There's a change in one's relation to death. One is no longer afraid of it, or perhaps not even concerned about it. There is a very deep feeling of openness in relationship to all of life, or everything in the universe. There's a feeling of ultimately knowing all that's worthwhile knowing, and yet at the same time feeling like you're no one special at all. This is simply the way everything is. There is an automatic compassion toward every other being, and also a feeling of greater effectiveness and intelligence in approaching life. Now, I would say it's probably an understatement to say that this kind of, either as a transitory state or as a more permanent change in being, that this kind of thing is of interest to science and to psychology. This is vitally interesting. It's personally desirable, of course. I would love to experience the universe as John experiences it, or as Buck experienced it. And I also think that moving in this direction is essential if the planet's going to survive. Remember, a primary characteristic of ordinary consensus trance is separateness. And when it comes down to it, if it's a choice between me and you, since we're separate, I'll choose me. You know, people may tell us we're all one, but that's a lot of words. And when the instincts of this body has to be saved, this personality has to be pleasured, when they become strong, those philosophies easily go by the by. But if we can find ways of helping people to more directly experience something like cosmic consciousness or enlightenment, then a real change can happen. And of course, I said earlier that I'm talking about dramatic examples here, but there are many more quiet and subtle things that happen as people move in this direction that are important. How am I doing on time, Bill? Okay. I'll say just a little bit about how can we as real human beings then do something to get a little more enlightened. One thing that I find more and more need to stress, since we Westerners simply tend to want a quick fix, is to give up the quick fix idea and realize that this path starts with basic morality. Someone once said, as a Buddhist perspective, it's hard to quiet your mind in meditation if you've been out looting and killing all day long. But it's a little more profound than that. The perspective from these high enlightenment perspectives is that we are all one. And frankly, then it simply becomes stupid to hurt anybody else. You're hurting yourself. And if that's the way you feel about yourself, how could you possibly open up to any other aspects of yourself? So a basic morality is the foundation for this. And that means we can't skip basic developmental tasks in learning how to deal with each other. Many people are attracted to the idea of enlightenment because they don't get along very well in the world, and rather than discover what the problem is and cure it, it's easier to say, well, the world is corrupt, I'm going to follow a spiritual path and bypass all that. Can't do that. As Jack Engler, an American Buddhist teacher, once said, you've got to be somebody before you can be nobody. So you start with this moral foundation, and then taking, and I can't possibly cover all this, but just as one approach, looking at a Buddhist thing, you develop concentration skills and insight skills. When you look at our ordinary mind, it's terribly fragmented. It's jumping all over the place. We can't focus on anything very long. That makes it very hard to really understand anything more deeply. And of course, as I said earlier, we live in this biopsycho-virtual reality. That ordinary mind jumping all over is creating a pseudo-reality, a virtual reality all the time that fools us. So the Buddhist path, for instance, emphasizes first concentrative meditation, where you learn to put the mind on one thing and keep it there. Not by gritting your teeth and trying to kill any thought that comes in, but by learning to keep coming back to one thing. And this gradually strengthens our ability to pay attention. And as that ability strengthens, you then apply it to what I often think of as a scientific investigation of your own inner nature. What am I really that I can see through direct experience? Not what do I think I ought to be. What am I actually? What am I actually experiencing at this moment before I cover it up in layers of thoughts and feelings? So you turn from simply concentration to insight into your true self to eventually get to deeper and deeper levels of insight. Those insights can involve a lot of things, but some of the key things they involve, for instance, are one phenomena often called emptiness, which is a terrible word because it implies nothing, which isn't the case at all. A better word is impermanence, to realize the changeableness that goes on all the time and the fact that we identify with what is changeable, both in the outside world and in ourselves. So there's a great emphasis on Buddhism on impermanence, on transience, because our ordinary mind has this tendency to over-concretize things, to treat things as eternal. Someone frowned at me, I'm going to be unhappy forever. It's just a momentary event. When you begin to see the impermanence of the ordinary self, you stop giving it so much energy, you stop identifying with it so strongly, and then the possibility of getting glimpses of this deeper self, perhaps these full cosmic consciousness experience, begin to happen. Also, you eventually need to develop the insights that were talked about here, the inherently compassionate nature of reality. Now, Buddhism is very sophisticated here on a tricky point, which I think it's important to point out. There is a quality of these enlightenment experiences in which you see that everything is perfect. You know, a child's being run down by a lorry, that's perfect. It's all part of the perfection of everything. The war in Bosnia, it's all perfect.
That is a component of the Enlightenment experience, to realize there is a perspective from which it's all perfect. But yet, as people get deeper insights, this inherent compassion comes in. You must never use the feeling that it's all perfect to not act in a compassionate way. That's a very bad distortion. So you always strive to be helpful, to be loving, compassionate whenever possible, even if from another perspective things are perfect. If you find that a little bit confusing, that's all right. It's not supposed to really be understandable on our ordinary level of consciousness, but it's potentially experienceable. Again, I said there were certain assumptions we made in approaching this, but these are potentially testable, experienceable as to whether they're true. What can psychology do? Finally, my point, to help us get enlightened. How can modern scientific psychology and science in general be of some help? I said earlier that psychology has expert knowledge on endarkenment without any concept of enlightenment. To give you, we know the specifics of how we misidentify, how we mess things up, how we distort our simulation of the world. I'll give you a dozen items. I said I ought to give a brief list of some of the mechanisms we know that contribute to endarkenment. I'll look in the index of an introductory psychology book. I have a very long list here. I'll read you a dozen just to give you a feeling that we know a great deal about the flavors of this. Abuse, acceptance, anger, anxiety, attitude, attribution errors, aversion, beliefs, biases, bystander effects, competition, compliance, compulsion, concepts. All right, I just got up to C. We know a great deal about this. It's my hope that as psychology and science in general expands its perspective, that we'll begin to understand more about these blocks that keep us from realizing our transpersonal selves or not selves, that keep us from expanding into this larger and very vital perspective. I particularly hope that someday we'll have a sophisticated enough understanding of how this is done to be able to give people specific help on how to grow, on how to find a spiritual path. You know, if you go to someone who is very good at spiritual things, what they'll tell you to do is probably what they did. And yet, I think we know from modern psychology that what is a wonderful set of spiritual growth for one person is a total waste of time for a second person and might be an invitation to psychosis for a third person. If we knew enough about the individual ways in which enlightenment is prevented to be able to specifically prescribe, as it were, your type of person should never do Sufi dancing because there's a 30% psychosis rate, but the satisfaction with Zen sitting is much higher. That would be a wonderful contribution we could make. Well, I'm going to end at this point. I'm going to end, in a sense, rather suddenly. I haven't really told you what enlightenment is. I've just pointed. I've hopefully stretched your mind in a certain direction, and now it's up to us. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions, and we will start right there.
I'm almost completely overwhelmed by the beauty and the clarity with which you describe not only the experiences, but also the analysis and possibilities as well. Like I said, fortunately, some of my own experiences made it very possible to tune in to some of the things that you were saying, except there's just one little thing. Some of my own older states of consciousness led to a feeling of even the duality between a physical and a non-physical world seemed to be transcended. And that I came to the feeling that the brain is such a marvelous piece of energy, or spiritized matter, that it's not necessary to look beyond the brain to find an explanation for all these things. And I'm just a little bit curious as to why you hinted that you yourself feel that you do look beyond for something else.
From the Enlightenment perspective, I'd say it's perfectly fine to think that as long as you're not attached to that. You see, it goes back to this view I have of consciousness as being a virtual reality that we're constructing all the time, largely not knowing we're constructing it. Because we can construct our reality, we can selectively distort our experience and perception to provide a validation of what we believe already. And that's why the emphasis in the Enlightenment traditions on non-attachment. Not that you will never have a belief, a concept, a thought, something like that, but try to hold it lightly. All right? So some days I think, gosh, maybe brain functioning will explain this. Maybe not. Either way, I'll look. Be very careful of beliefs. Beliefs, as I say, tend to shape your experience to do that. On a more objective level, going just beyond the way one runs one's own mind, parapsychological research has been one of my areas, part-time for a long time. I've seen lots of evidence that makes me into what I call a pragmatic dualist. Mind does certain kinds of things of an extrasensory sort which don't fit any model of brain functioning that I know at this point, that doesn't fit any reasonable extension of physics, although whether it's things like quantum physics are reasonable is beyond my comprehension. So I think at this point in time, if you want to understand mind, sure, let's learn all we can about the brain. I mean, we're driving this car. But at the same time, certain questions about mind need to be asked at the level of mind. I think we're more likely to get answers. If you ask me again in 30 or 40 years, things may have changed. I don't know. I try not to be too attached to that.
That's to recognize where we see those facts.
My name's Kate Collins. Charlie, I'd just like to say thank you so much for what you've done. You've just stated in the course of an hour and a half what gurus take years to try and state. I had just one tiny little thing to say, which was that you appeared to equate emptiness with impermanence. And I'd just like to say that they're not usually seen as synonymous, in that emptiness can be stated positively, if you want to state it positively, in terms of dependent arising on causes, conditions, etc. And really the statement that under analysis nothing can be found which is a discrete, separate, independent entity. I just wanted to say that.
Yes, very interesting ideas, but you understand, of course, they have to go into direct experience rather than ideas. I just don't like that word emptiness. It tends to imply the wrong thing. I often use it in the other sense myself, but I still don't like the word. Tricky.
Do we recognize this gentleman in the front row? Dr. Tart, I enjoyed your talk very much. Have you had enlightenment? And if so, are you able to tell us a bit about your enlightenment?
No, I told you my specialty is endarkenment. So I do believe that if I stop doing the things that make me so endarkened, I move in the right direction. But seriously, I have not experienced any of that intense kind of experience. All right? I hope that I will someday, although my ordinary self is also rather frightened at the thought of what that might be. Meanwhile, I do try to spend some time meditating or practicing mindfulness in everyday life or the like, and there are moments of quiet and clarity which I find quite rewarding. In fact, when I'm in one of those quiet, mindful states, I often wonder what all this verbal fuss is about, but then I forget all about being quiet and mindful.
Way up here, please. I'm Glenn Ennis. Just wanted to go back to your assumptions about day-to-day experience being a subset. And just a comment that it seems to me more like a phase change, shifting from a very broad, open experience into one where, sort of like water to ice, where there's more structure. And so in some sense, there's some slowing down, some lessening of activity, and in some sense, but it seems a slowing down in the sense that there's more thought, and,
yes,
and therefore constructing.
Yes. You've also made me aware that I may have left a wrong assumption the way I stated that it's bad to be in a constricted state of consciousness. And I don't want to say that. It's bad to be stuck there. But let's put it this way. If your car broke down, who would you rather have show up, Jesus, Buddha, or a mechanic? A constricted state is also a focused state. That's very good for certain things. That's a very difficult question, actually, as I think about it. But if you're to have the car run again.
Also depend on whether I had an oil slick to walk across.
There you go.
Hi, Charlie. I want you to know that what I'm going to say isn't especially critical, and I feel full of compassion towards you. I'm Mike Boddington. What you described as enlightenment were some mystical experiences, and my understanding of what Buddha achieved, he achieved not as a result of a spontaneous activity that occurred to him or a spontaneous experience. It was something that he worked towards for a long time, and that there is the story of an ancient who came to see him, who was on the same path and knew that the end was near, and he said to Buddha, please tell me how I can achieve enlightenment. And the Buddha said, well, this isn't something I normally do, you understand, but because it's you and because it's the end of your life. And
what? Would you say that again?
No, you got to get it the first time. And the man died in enlightenment, so the story has it. So presumably the Buddha was able to convey to this man the secret. I want to just say one other thing, and that is that I do not have any actual memory of an experience such as the ones that you described from Buck and others. But I can relate to what you were describing, and it seems to touch what I would call a virtual memory in me. And I wonder whether other people have that experience as well.
Well, we could be empirical, and I could say, how many people felt that these stories touched something within you? Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Best possible result. Thank you for your comment.
Way up there, please.
I just wish you'd whispered a little louder.
Wonderful talk. I enjoyed it very, very much. You made us laugh, which is raised the tone of the conference tremendously. It's given us something to take home, which is very special. My name is Pam Crane. I live in Faversham, about a mile from Bob Geldof. And so I'm talking about compassion because you raised this issue. These days, communications have accelerated tremendously. So a tremendous proportion of the world's population is now more aware of how the other half lives and the terrible difficulties that many people have to endure. So there are great calls now on human compassion, very obvious calls, and in many different ways, and people do respond in many different ways. Now, when Goldof went to Ethiopia and he came back, he started talking about compassion fatigue. This raises all kinds of questions. One being, do you see this as symptomatic that humanity as a whole is beginning to move towards a more collective enlightenment as humanity? And have you any comments on how one can handle these great calls on our compassion for so many people all at once?
All right, thank you. There are two components that I pull out of that question. One is the need for compassion. Yes, it's also amazing how uncompassionate we can be. The big distinction I see is that it's one thing to tell people they should be compassionate. Not that we should stop doing that, but that's a demand imposed on you from outside that you may or may not respond to, that may interact with various other psychological factors in you that make it twisted in funny ways. But it's certainly very valuable, but my primary hope is that we would develop a more effective technology, if I may use that word, to let people resonate with or have these deeper experiences so that compassion comes from inside out. All right? Now, I don't know how to do that directly. I don't know some way to say, here's an exercise that will make you all more compassionate. I have learned something about helping people become more sensitive to the blocks, to the things that use up our energy, that divert us, that defend us from seeing this. And compassion is difficult.
In introducing me, Willis mentioned my books, Waking Up and Living the Mindful Life, and they're about becoming more mindful of what actually is going on at the moment. But in attempting to practice that myself, I noticed, for instance, that when a situation involves other people suffering, where I wish my automatic response was not only more mindfulness but compassion, a lot of times I'm afraid to sense that full suffering. And I go more deeply asleep instead of becoming more mindful. And that's just where I'm stuck at. As to modern communications, indeed, in a way, they help make us one culture, one planet. We know about things. On the other hand, they're very dangerous. I often say our culture's got the biggest and best samsara that ever existed on the face of the planet. We in America, and eventually the whole world, unfortunately, will eventually have 500 channels of television 24 hours a day. You need never have a quiet moment with your own mind. That's really frightening, to distract yourself forever and ever. Now, necessity will come in and break up this cozy samsara, of course, because there is a reality out there. But modern communications is mixed in that respect. Great positive potential, but so easily used to distract yourself from what's really real.
We have 3 people lined up, and that's all we'll have time for before we have to break. The lady right there, please. The other microphone can go way up there.
Hazel Guest, I wanted to ask you if you distinguish between cosmic consciousness and enlightenment. It seems from your talk that there is not a distinction, but it seems to me that there are 2 types of altered state here which can usefully be distinguished. I have a research interest in this to do with skin resistance phenomena. On the one hand, you have that state of which your 2 illustrations would be relevant, I think, which can be reached by contemplative meditation or concentrated meditation. And then there's what I'm used to calling the insight experience, which can be reached by mindfulness meditation. On the one hand, you have an experience of the oneness, the sinking into the void, perhaps, would be one way of saying it. On the other hand, you have a sudden flash of insight, and you suddenly snap into an altered state. As far as my own interest is concerned, the skin resistance correlates. The concentrated one is characterized by a gradual raising of the skin resistance to a kind of plateau.
Yes.
The other is a sudden drop in skin resistance and a very, very smooth phenomenon while that state is experienced. So I wondered if you'd comment on those 2.
I'm very glad you're doing that kind of research. Okay, I believe we need lots of research here. I believe the best of scientific method and openness needs and rigor needs to be married to the spiritual search to clarify things. You're taking a step in that direction. Of course, we have to distinguish various kinds of altered states of consciousness rather than lumping them together. It's very important. And some of the time I do this. On the other hand, again, to come back to the point I made earlier about not too much attachment, there are times when I'm having a high-level theoretical distinction about different levels of enlightenment with someone when I suddenly realize this is like 2 children in the 1st grade having a discussion over whether the mathematics graduate program at Cambridge or Oxford is superior. It may be a passionate discussion, it may be an exciting discussion, but neither one of them has any conception of what mathematics is all about, much less being able to compare the 2 things. So if we can do this without getting overly attached, yes. Your results make excellent sense in terms of what I remember from my psychophysiological research days. I hope you'll publish them soon.
Thank you. We have another question up here and then one down here in the 2nd row, and that's it.
My name is Philip Goodchild. Thank you very much for that very wonderful account. I think it's one of our great tragedies that we don't have these kind of first-hand reports that come out of places like Auschwitz and Buchenwald and Dachau. Presumably they were all burnt at the time. It's one of the problems I wrestle with. And another one is that, as I'm sure you're well aware, the kind of characteristics you were describing.
Could you speak slightly louder?
Sorry. The kind of characteristics that you were describing in these experiences also happen in the context of people who find it very hard to manage in life, who are perhaps diagnosed as psychotic or schizophrenic. So my big question that comes out of that for me, which I find very important, is could it be that these examples you've given from Bach or Lewis or even the Buddha, could they be another form of trance?
Depending on what you mean by trance, yes. Remember, I conceive of ordinary consciousness as a simulation, as a virtual reality going on. You can get simulations of genuine experiences. For instance, some years ago when I was working intensively with hypnosis, I had a group of extremely talented hypnotic subjects, and under hypnosis they were able to experience some marvelous out-of-the-body experiences, an absolutely real experience of leaving the laboratory, going downtown, going in the room across the hall, experientially perfectly real. Of course, their descriptions of what was in the room across the hall were totally inaccurate. Now, I believe that out-of-the-body experiences can sometimes actually give you veridical information about the world. I've done studies on that. But you can also have a simulation of the experience that's not the same thing at all. I'm sure we can get simulations of enlightenment experience. The ultimate test is, I think, what it does to you in the long run. A colleague of mine's wife, Etta Dykman, Arthur Dykman's done some great research on meditation, says, you know, the real test of whether a person's enlightened is what their spouse says about them. So we do have to come back to practical things here. I mean, it's easy to get off into exotic mental phenomena, but we have to keep with this question you've raised of what does it translate into? Is it just some kind of trance or diversion? One more of those 500 channels. Yes, it's a good point.
Over here, please.
Angela Reed, thank you very much. I'm here. I'm here.
I still haven't found you.
Yes. It's just wonderful.
In case anyone doubted, that's a good proof that I'm not enlightened. I can't see what's in front of my face.
Oh, Charlie, thank you very much. Each encounter with you is very special. And anyone who's new to you, I think, will never find it unforgettable. You've actually answered the question about the quality of living as a consequence of enlightenment. And I think we're perhaps too attached to that one ultimate experience, rather than looking at the hundreds of people who, through their own living, actually live in an ethical way that is absolutely beautiful and spiritual. And I love your iconoclastic psychological approach. Very revealing and very teaching for us. I'm just wondering whether psychology will become, with people like yourself and some of the other people who are in the network and around, a new way of bringing us to enlightenment because of the understanding about the blocks. And I find the way you present the blocks to us very helpful for us to deal with them.
Well, you're asking me to make a prediction about the future. Who was it denied having a crystal ball the other day? If I have anything to do with it, psychology will become more open to this and become helpful to real people in this. And if the network has anything to do with it, the Institute of Noetic Sciences has anything to do with it. Whether our hope will prevail, whether it should prevail from the ultimate perspective, I don't know, but I certainly think, ordinary psychology has an immense amount to give people to increase our freedom and give us a chance to truly experience the depths. Whether we use it or not, that's a social question that becomes much more difficult to answer. But you're also, one other point I want to comment on, you're also right in, I forget exactly how you phrased it, but we have to be careful not to become attached to these experiences. When I first became interested in this, I read Maurice Buck's book, Cosmic Consciousness, which is really one of the great classics. And after he had his cosmic consciousness experience, he went out and looked for examples of this in the world. And he only found, if I recall, 25, 30 examples of this, of people who had attained full cosmic consciousness. And not only that, he found that essentially all of these people had attained it by the time they were 35 years old. Well, my 35th birthday came and went. And of course, as a scientist, I decided that Buck's hypothesis was wrong. I
became very attached to worrying of, well, I haven't made it. What do they say about physicists, Brian? You know, they're burned out by 22 if they haven't had a brilliant idea by then. But hopefully in psychology there's a longer span here. We mustn't become attached to these concepts. That's the important thing. That's why when Willis was asking me about introducing me, I thought about the popularity of Dennett's book, Consciousness Explained, and I thought, no, we don't need to explain it away. And unfortunately, that's what science has come to represent for many people, explaining things away, invalidating things. Yes, it's important to discriminate what the reality aspects of things are, but we need to expand our concept of consciousness, not explain it away. That's a dispiriting direction to go in. Thank you for your comment.
With that summary, let us express our appreciation.